7 women have stood in this exact doorway, and every single one of them left me. Tell me why you'll be any different." Nathan Cole's voice cracked like a whip across the empty parlor, cold, daring, half hoping she'd turn and run like all the others. Evelyn Harper didn't flinch. She set down her single travel bag and looked him dead in the eye. "Because I'm not here to stay for your money, your land, or your name. I'm here because I see a man everyone else gave up on too soon." For the first time in 10 years, Nathan Cole had no answer. Before we begin, hit subscribe, follow this channel, and stay with me until the very last word. Drop a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. The ring hit the floorboards and rolled in a slow, wobbling circle before it dropped flat, and the sound of metal on wood was the only thing in the room besides Nathan Cole's breathing. Margaret Fenwick stood in the doorway with her traveling case already packed. She hadn't even bothered to take off her gloves. "You're a cruel man, Nathan Cole," she said, her voice shaking but her spine straight. "I came here ready to be your wife. I came here ready to build something with you. And you looked at me tonight like I was a stranger who wandered into your house by accident." "You are a stranger," Nathan said. "We've known each other 4 months. You don't know the first thing about me. I know you own 6,000 acres. I know you have more cattle than any man in 3 counties. I know." "That's exactly my point." Nathan's voice dropped low flat, the voice of a man who had said this before more times than he wanted to count. "You know what I have. You don't know who I am. Nobody ever bothers to find out." Margaret's chin trembled. For a moment, just a moment, something almost like pity crossed her face, and Nathan almost hated her for it. "Maybe," she said quietly, "if you let someone try." "I let you try for 4 months. You didn't let me do anything. You built a wall the day I arrived and you've been standing behind it ever since. I don't know what happened to you, Nathan, but I know I can't spend the rest of my life married to a wall." She turned. She walked out. The door closed behind her, not slammed, just closed, gentle and final. And somehow, that gentleness was worse than if she'd screamed at him. Nathan stood alone in the parlor of a house with 14 rooms. He looked down at the ring on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He walked to the window instead and watched Margaret's carriage roll down the long dirt road toward town dust, rising behind the wheels in the fading gold light. And something in his chest twisted the way it always twisted, the way it had twisted 7 times now, and he told himself the same lie he always told himself. It doesn't matter. It never mattered. But it did. Every single time it mattered a little more, and every single time he buried it a little deeper. By morning, all of Silver Creek knew. "7," said Hiram Coates, leaning against the counter of the general store, shaking his head at the men gathered around him. 7 brides, and every last one of them ran off that ranch faster than a rabbit from a wildfire. "I heard this one left the ring on his floor," said another man. "I heard Nathan Cole threw it," said a third, and the men chuckled the low, uneasy chuckle of people talking about a man they were half afraid of and half sorry for. "He wasn't always like this," said old Mrs. Abernathy from behind the counter, not looking up from the ledger she was working on. "I remember when that boy used to smile." "That was before Charlotte," Hiram said, and the name landed in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. Nobody said anything else after that. Nobody needed to. Charlotte Reyes had been the woman Nathan Cole loved before he became the man Silver Creek now whispered about. 8 years earlier, when Nathan's ranch had been nothing but 400 struggling acres and a herd too small to survive one bad winter, Charlotte had promised to marry him. She'd worn his ring for 2 years. She'd told him she loved him under every star in Montana. Then the drought came. Then the bank came calling. Then Nathan spent 18 months working from before dawn until after dark, coming home too exhausted to speak, watching every dollar disappear into keeping the herd alive. Charlotte left in the spring. She didn't leave with cruelty. She left with tears, real ones, and she told him something that carved itself into his chest and never came back out. "I don't want a hard life, Nathan. I want a comfortable one. I love you, but I can't love hunger. I can't love worry. I need a man who can give me a future, not just a promise of one. She married a merchant in Bozeman 8 months later. Nathan heard about it from a stranger passing through, delivered so casually, he almost didn't understand what the man had said until the words had already cut him open. That was the day something closed inside Nathan Cole. Not broke. Closed. Like a door locking from the inside, and only Nathan had the key, and Nathan had decided a long time ago that no one would ever get that key again. He built his ranch into an empire after that. 6,000 acres, nearly 1,000 head of cattle. The kind of success men in Montana Territory talked about with envy and admiration. And every single night, he sat alone at a table built for 20 guests with one plate in front of him and ate his supper in a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. 7 women had tried to end that silence. 7 women had failed. He doesn't need a wife, Hiram said, shaking his head as he counted out change for a customer. He needs a miracle. 200 miles away in a town called Miller's Gulch, a woman named Evelyn Harper folded the last of her belongings into a single traveling bag and looked around the small room that had been her whole world for the past 3 years. There wasn't much to look at. A narrow bed, a washstand, a cracked mirror that made her face look longer than it actually was, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, its spine worn soft from years of handling. Evelyn was 26 years old, and she had buried more people than most folks buried in a lifetime twice as long as hers. Her mother dead from fever when Evelyn was 19. Her father dead from a fall off a half-built barn roof 2 years later. Her husband Thomas dead 11 months ago, thrown from a horse on a job he'd taken to make ends meet after their small farm failed. She had no children, no family left to speak of, no money beyond what little remained after Thomas's burial. And now the small room she rented above the seamstress shop was being given to someone else because Evelyn could no longer afford the rent, because the seamstress work Evelyn did with her own hands paid barely enough to keep her fed, let alone housed. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the newspaper advertisement she'd read 17 times already. Wanted housekeeper for large cattle ranch near Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Must be capable, hard-working, and unafraid of solitude. Room and board provided. Wages fair. Inquire in person. There was no mention of a name. No mention of what unafraid of solitude truly meant. But something about those 4 words, unafraid of solitude, struck something deep in Evelyn's chest, because solitude was the only thing she had left, and she had learned slowly and painfully not to be afraid of it. She had nowhere else to go. She had no other offers, no other prospects, and no more tears left to cry about either fact. So, the next morning, Evelyn Harper packed her single bag, saddled the old sway-backed mare that was the last thing of value she owned, and set out on the long ride toward Silver Creek, Montana, toward a ranch she had never seen, owned by a man whose name she did not even know. The ride took 4 days. By the second day, Evelyn's hands were blistered from the reins. By the third day, her back ached in ways she hadn't known a body could ache. By the 4th day, hunger had become a familiar, dull companion sitting low in her stomach, because she'd rationed her food carefully, unsure exactly how far her few remaining coins needed to stretch. But she didn't turn back. Evelyn Harper had learned something in the last 3 years that most people never had to learn. Turning back was rarely an option that actually existed. There was only forward, whatever forward looked like, however hard forward turned out to be. When she finally saw the gate to the Cole Ranch rising out of the golden grassland in the late afternoon light, she stopped the mare and simply looked at it for a long moment. It was larger than she'd imagined. The main house alone looked bigger than the entire boarding house she'd lived in back in Miller's Gulch. Barns stretched out behind it, and beyond that grazing land that seemed to roll on forever, cattle scattered across it like small dark stones on an endless green blanket. This is a place where a woman could disappear, Evelyn thought. Or a place where a woman could finally be found. She didn't know yet which one it would be. She nudged the mare forward toward the gate, toward whatever waited on the other side of it. Nathan Cole was standing near the corral fence when he saw the rider approaching, and his first thought, The automatic thought he'd trained himself to have was irritation. Another traveler lost on the wrong road, probably. Or a peddler looking to sell him something he didn't need. Or worse, some hopeful mother's daughter sent by a matchmaking neighbor because word of his failed engagements had apparently traveled far enough that people now saw him as some kind of desperate project. He walked toward the gate with the tired, guarded posture of a man expecting disappointment before it even arrived. Evelyn dismounted before he reached her. She didn't wait for him to help her down, didn't wait for an invitation, just swung off the mare with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing hard things alone for a very long time. "Afternoon," she said. Her voice was steady, plain, with none of the performance he'd grown so used to hearing from women who arrived at his gate with marriage in their eyes before they'd even learned his first name. "Afternoon," Nathan said, cautious. "Can I help you with something? I saw the advertisement for a housekeeper." Nathan blinked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, that hadn't been on the list. "You rode 4 days for a housekeeping position. I rode 4 days because I needed work and a place to live, and this was the only advertisement I found that didn't require references from a husband or a father." She said it without bitterness, without self-pity, just simple fact laid out plain like a stone on a table. "I don't have either anymore." Nathan studied her for a long moment. She was travel-worn, dust settled into the creases of her dress, her hair coming loose from its pins, and there was an exhaustion in her face that went deeper than 4 days on a horse could explain. But her eyes didn't waver. She looked at him directly without flinching, without the careful, calculating softness he'd grown so tired of seeing in women who wanted something from him. "You know what people say about this ranch," Nathan said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know what people say about you," Evelyn corrected. "That you're difficult. That you've run off 7 women who tried to marry you. I'm not here to marry you, Mr. Cole. I'm here because I can cook, I can clean, I can manage a household, and I need honest work more than I need comfort or kindness." Something in Nathan's chest shifted just slightly, the way ice shifts before it cracks, though neither of them noticed it yet. "Most people who come here want something from me," he said. "Money, land, a name to attach themselves to." "I want a roof and fair wages," Evelyn said. "That's all. I don't need you to be kind to me, Mr. Cole. I only need you to be honest. Tell me what the work requires. Tell me what you expect, and I'll tell you if I can do it. That's the only conversation I came here for." Nathan stared at her. For 10 years, women had walked onto his land with soft words and softer eyes, promising devotion, promising love, promising forever, and every single one of them had eventually shown him the true shape of what they wanted, which was never him. Not really. It was his money, his land, the comfort his success could buy them. This woman hadn't mentioned any of it. She'd mentioned wages, fair wages, as though the money itself was simply payment for labor, not a prize to be won through affection she didn't actually feel. "The position doesn't pay much," Nathan said, testing her, watching for the disappointment he expected to flicker across her face. It didn't come. "Then it pays what it pays," Evelyn said. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Cole. I'm asking for work." Nathan looked past her toward the mare standing patient and tired behind her, toward the single travel bag strapped to its saddle. And something about the modesty of it, the plainness of it, struck him harder than any of the expensive dresses and delicate parasols the other women had arrived carrying. "The house has 14 rooms," he said slowly. "Most of them haven't been properly cleaned in years. The kitchen serves 20 men most mornings when the full crew is working. There's no other woman on this ranch to help you, and the nearest neighbor is 6 miles off. It's hard, lonely work, Miss Harper. Evelyn Harper." She paused. "And I've done harder, lonelier work than that, Mr. Cole. Believe me." Something in the way she said it, quiet and unadorned, told Nathan she wasn't exaggerating for effect. There was real weight behind those words, a weight she carried without asking anyone to help her carry it. He hesitated a moment longer. "All right," he finally said. "You can start tomorrow morning. Rooms in the back of the house, small but clean. Wages get paid the first of every month. If it doesn't work out, I'll pack my bag and leave without complaint," Evelyn said. "You won't need to throw anything at me, Mr. Cole. I heard about the ring." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathan Cole felt his mouth twitch, almost into something that might have become a smile if he'd let it go any further. He didn't let it go any further. "Barn's that way if you need to settle your horse," he said instead, turning and walking back toward the house without another word. Evelyn watched him go, this tall, guarded man who moved like someone carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel after 4 exhausting days on the road. Not hope exactly. She'd learned not to trust hope too quickly, but something close to it. Something small and careful, like the first tiny shoot of grass pushing up through hard-packed earth after a long winter. She led her mare toward the barn. The first week on the Cole ranch tested every ounce of strength Evelyn had left in her body. She woke before the sun each morning, moving through the enormous echoing house with a bucket and rags, scrubbing floors that hadn't seen proper cleaning in what looked like years. She beat the dust from curtains until her arms burned. She organized a pantry that had clearly been neglected, throwing out spoiled goods and reorganizing what remained with careful efficiency. She cooked for the ranch hands, 12 men at first, then more as the summer work increased, learning quickly which men liked their coffee strong and which ones needed extra biscuits because they worked the farthest pastures and came back hungriest. The ranch hands noticed her almost immediately, and their reactions surprised her. "You're still here," said a weathered old cowhand named Silas on her 4th morning, watching her set a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of him. "Was I not supposed to be?" Evelyn asked. Silas exchanged a glance with the younger hand sitting beside him, a lanky boy named Jesse, who couldn't have been more than 20. "No offense, ma'am," Silas said carefully, "but most folks who come to work in that house don't last past the first week. The boss ain't exactly—" He stopped himself, glanced toward the door as though checking whether Nathan might overhear. "He ain't exactly easy to work for. He's fair," Jesse offered quickly, loyal despite himself. "Just quiet and cold, real cold." "I've noticed," Evelyn said simply and went back to the stove. But she had noticed something else too. Something the ranch hands seemed not to fully see, buried, as they were in their own long-standing impressions of the man who employed them. She noticed that when a young hand named Tommy took a bad fall from his horse in her 2nd week, Nathan was the first man at his side, and it was Nathan's own horse that carried Tommy the 6 miles into town to see the doctor, Nathan riding alongside the whole way, refusing to let anyone else take the responsibility. She noticed that Nathan paid his men promptly, and fairly more fairly than most ranch owners she'd heard of, and that he never once raised his voice at a man for an honest mistake. She noticed that late at night, long after the house had gone quiet, a light often still burned in his office, and sometimes she heard the low murmur of his voice through the door, though there was never anyone else in the room with him. She was curious about that murmuring, but she didn't ask. She had learned through hard experience that people revealed themselves in their own time, if they revealed themselves at all, and prying rarely earned anything but a slammed door. 3 weeks into her employment, Evelyn had her first real conversation with Nathan Cole since the day she'd arrived. It happened by accident, the way most important things seem to happen. Nathan had come back from a brutal day settling a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher, a dispute that had apparently turned ugly, judging by the tightness in his jaw and the exhausted slump of his shoulders as he walked through the door well past dark. Normally, Evelyn knew by now he would go straight to his office and not emerge until morning. That night, without really thinking about it, without weighing the decision, the way she usually weighed her decisions on this ranch, Evelyn poured a cup of coffee and set it on the small table near the entrance, right in Nathan's path. He stopped, stared at the cup, then looked at her standing near the kitchen doorway, not saying anything, not explaining anything, just having done the small quiet thing without ceremony. "What's this?" Nathan asked, his voice rough with fatigue. "Coffee," Evelyn said. "You looked like you needed it." "I didn't ask for coffee." "I know. I didn't ask if you wanted it either." Nathan looked at the cup a moment longer, then picked it up, testing the warmth of it against his palms before taking a slow sip. "Bad day," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. something in between an offering he wasn't used to making. "I gathered that," Evelyn said. "You don't have to tell me about it." "I wasn't going to. I know that too." Something almost like a laugh, dry and rusty from disuse, escaped Nathan's throat, though it died quickly, like he'd caught himself doing something forbidden. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The question came out sharper than he intended, edged with something that sounded almost like suspicion. The old worn suspicion of a man who had been disappointed too many times to trust a kindness without looking for the hook hidden inside it. Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "Because everyone deserves one person who notices when they're tired," she said finally. "That's all. Nothing more complicated than that." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Most people notice my land," he said quietly. "My cattle, my money." "I've noticed those things too," Evelyn admitted. "It's hard not to working here, but that's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words with the same careful precision she used for everything else in her life. "I meant you, Mr. Cole. Not what you have. Just you. A man who works from before dawn until after dark, who treats his hands fairly, who rode 6 miles alongside an injured boy just to make sure he got proper care, and who comes home every night to an empty house and eats alone at a table built for 20 people. She paused. "That's what I noticed." Nathan's jaw tightened. For a moment, Evelyn thought she'd overstepped. Thought he might turn and walk away, the way he walked away from everything uncomfortable, retreating into the safety of his office and his silence. Instead, he just stood there, coffee cup in his hands, staring at her, like she'd said something in a language he'd forgotten how to speak, but somehow still understood. "Nobody's said something like that to me in a long time," he said finally quietly, almost to himself. "Then it was overdue," Evelyn said simply. She turned back toward the kitchen, giving him space, giving him the same quiet distance she always gave him, never pushing, never demanding, never asking for more than he was willing to offer. But as she walked away, she heard him say so soft, she almost missed it. "Thank you for the coffee." It wasn't much. 4 small words. But Evelyn understood with a certainty she couldn't quite explain that those 4 words had cost Nathan Cole more effort than most men's entire declarations of love. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the small room at the back of the enormous house, Evelyn thought about Thomas, about the quiet, uncomplicated love they'd shared before his death, about how simple loving someone had once felt. She thought about Nathan Cole, this hard-guarded, lonely man, who flinched from kindness like it might burn him. She didn't know yet what she felt toward him. It was too soon, too complicated, too tangled up in grief and survival, and the strange, careful dance of 2 wounded people, learning to exist in the same space without hurting each other further. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she drifted toward sleep. She wasn't leaving, not like the others, not unless he made her. And something told her, some quiet instinct she couldn't quite name, that Nathan Cole didn't actually want her to leave, even if he didn't know it himself yet. The weeks that followed brought small, quiet changes to the Cole Ranch, changes so gradual that no single day seemed different from the one before it yet. When Evelyn looked back at the beginning of her 2nd month, she could see how far things had shifted. Nathan began eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of taking a tray to his office. He didn't say much during these meals, but his presence at the table sitting across from Evelyn, while the ranch hands filed in and out, felt different from the isolated distance he'd maintained before. He started asking her opinion on small household matters, whether they should hire another hand for the coming harvest, whether the roof on the east barn needed repair before winter. Small practical questions that had nothing to do with romance or courtship, but everything to do with trust, with the slow, careful building of partnership between 2 people learning to occupy the same life. One afternoon in early August, a fierce, sudden thunderstorm rolled across the Montana plains, the kind of storm that turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise and sent every hand scrambling to secure the herd before hail could do real damage. Nathan was out in it for hours, soaked to the bone, working alongside his men to move cattle to shelter. And when he finally came back to the house, well past dark, he was shivering, exhausted, his lips faintly blue with cold. Evelyn didn't ask questions. She simply set to work, building up the fire in the parlor, fetching dry clothes, putting a kettle on for tea, moving through the house with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. "You don't have to fuss over me," Nathan said, though his voice lacked any real protest behind it, worn thin by exhaustion. "I'm not fussing," Evelyn said. "I'm making sure my employer doesn't catch his death of cold and leave me without wages." A ghost of a smile crossed Nathan's face there, and gone so quickly, Evelyn almost missed it. "Practical as ever," he murmured. "Someone has to be." She helped him settle near the fire, wrapping a heavy blanket around his shoulders, and for a moment, as she tucked the edge of the blanket in place, their eyes met, closer than they'd ever been. And something passed between them, wordless and startling. Something that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat, and made Nathan go very, very still. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Nathan looked away, first clearing his throat, breaking whatever strange, fragile thing had been building between them. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "For all of this." "You're welcome," Evelyn said, straightening up, putting careful distance back between them, though her heart was hammering in a way she hadn't expected, in a way she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to examine too closely. She left him by the fire and retreated to her room, and she lay awake a long time that night staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly was happening to her, wondering what exactly was happening to both of them in this strange, cautious, wordless dance they'd somehow begun, without either of them quite agreeing to it. 3 days later, everything changed. Evelyn was cleaning Nathan's office, a task she'd taken over from the general house cleaning because it was one of the few rooms Nathan actually allowed her into when she found the letters. They were tucked into the bottom drawer of his desk, tied together with a faded ribbon, the paper yellowed with age. She hadn't meant to find them. She'd been reorganizing the drawer at Nathan's own request, clearing out old receipts and correspondence he no longer needed, and the bundle had simply been there hidden beneath everything else. She knew immediately that she shouldn't read them, but something about the careful way they'd been tied, preserved, kept for years, despite obvious pain, made her hesitate before setting them aside unread. She untied the ribbon. The letters were from Charlotte Reyes. Evelyn had heard whispers of the name from the ranch hands, always spoken carefully, always followed by an uncomfortable silence. But she'd never known the full story until she read those letters, page after page, of a young Nathan Cole's heart laid bare. His hopes for their future together. His desperate promises that things would get better once the ranch stabilized his raw, unguarded love for a woman who ultimately couldn't wait for him to become the man he was, still all these years later, trying to become. The last letter wasn't from Charlotte at all. It was a letter Nathan had written but apparently never sent, dated just weeks after Charlotte's departure, and Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she read it. "I don't know how to explain what I feel, except to say that I built this ranch to prove something to a woman who's already gone, and now I don't know what I'm building it for anymore. I don't know how to want anything without being afraid of losing it. I think something in me broke Charlotte, and I don't know if it can be fixed. I don't know if I even want it fixed. It's easier this way. Nothing can hurt you if you don't let anything close enough to matter." Evelyn sat very still for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and something in her chest ached fiercely for this man, this hard-guarded, wounded man who had spent 8 years building walls so thick that even he seemed trapped inside them. She carefully retied the ribbon and placed the letters back exactly where she'd found them, and she said nothing to Nathan about what she'd discovered. But that evening, when Nathan came in from the fields, tired and quiet as always, Evelyn found herself watching him differently, seeing not just the hard, successful rancher the whole town whispered about, but the young man in those letters, the one who had once believed so completely in love that he'd poured his whole heart onto paper, only to have that heart handed back to him in pieces. "You're staring," Nathan said, catching her gaze across the kitchen table. "Sorry," Evelyn said, looking down at her hands. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated. Then carefully, gently, she said, "About how much a person can survive and still keep getting up every morning." Nathan went very still, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "That's an oddly specific thing to be thinking about," he said slowly, watching her with new wariness. "I found the letters," Evelyn admitted quietly. "I wasn't looking for them. They were in the drawer you asked me to clean out. I read one before I realized what it was, and then I couldn't stop myself from reading the rest. I'm sorry. It wasn't my place." Nathan set down his fork very carefully, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. "You had no right," he finally said, his voice low and tight. "I know," Evelyn said, "and I understand if you're angry with me. But I'm not sorry. I understand you a little better now, Nathan. I'm not sorry I know why you built that wall." "You don't know anything!" Nathan snapped, standing abruptly, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "You read a few letters. You don't know what it felt like to give everything to someone and watch them decide you weren't enough. You don't know what it's like to work yourself half to death trying to build a life for someone who was already planning to leave before the ink dried on your promises to her." "You're right," Evelyn said, her voice steady, despite the sharpness in his. "I don't know what that felt like for you specifically, but I know what it's like to lose everything, Nathan. I buried my mother, my father, and my husband all before I turned 26. I know what it's like to build a life around someone and then have to learn how to keep breathing after they're gone. So don't stand there and tell me I don't understand loss, because loss is the only thing I understand anymore." Nathan's anger faltered, caught off guard by the quiet ferocity in her words. "Your husband," he said slowly. "I didn't know." "You never asked," Evelyn said. "And I never offered. We've both been very careful not to ask each other too much, haven't we?" Nathan stared at her, something shifting behind his guarded eyes, some wall trembling under pressure it hadn't felt in a very long time. "A person can survive alone," Evelyn continued, softer now. "I know that better than most, but surviving alone isn't the same as choosing to live alone, Nathan. And I think somewhere along the way you stopped being able to tell the difference." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, filled with everything neither of them was quite ready to say. Finally, Nathan sat back down slowly, the fight draining out of him, replaced by something rawer, more exposed. "I built this ranch because I wanted to prove I could survive without anyone," he said quietly, echoing words that felt like they'd been sitting inside him for 8 long years, waiting for someone patient enough to draw them out. "But somewhere along the way, surviving became the only thing I knew how to do. I forgot how to do anything else. I forgot how to just live." Evelyn reached across the table, slowly giving him every opportunity to pull away, and rested her hand gently over his. "A person can survive alone," she said again, softer this time. "But that doesn't mean they're meant to live alone." Nathan looked down at her hand covering his, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his ranch, he didn't pull away. "Why are you still here, Evelyn?" he asked quietly. "After everything you've seen, after everything you now know, why haven't you left like the others?" Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Because I don't think you're actually the man this town believes you to be," she said. "I think you're a man who got hurt so badly once that you decided the only way to survive was to stop letting anyone close enough to hurt you again. But I don't think that's who you really are, Nathan. I think that's just who you became." Something fractured in Nathan's expression. Some final piece of armor finally giving way under the weight of being truly seen for the first time in 8 long, lonely years. "I don't know how to be anyone else anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to know right away," Evelyn said. "You just have to be willing to try." Neither of them moved for a long moment, her hand still resting over his. The kitchen quiet, except for the low crackle of the fire in the next room, and something passed between them. In that silence, something fragile and new and terrifying in its possibility. But before either of them could say anything more, before whatever was building between them could take its next fragile step forward, the sound of hurried footsteps and a sharp knock at the front door shattered the moment entirely. Nathan pulled his hand back and stood immediately, every guarded instinct snapping back into place as he moved toward the door. Silas stood on the porch, breathing hard, his face pale, even in the dim evening light. "Boss, you need to come quick," Silas said. "There's a man in town come in on the evening stage, saying he's got legal papers proving half this ranch's land don't rightfully belong to you." The words landed like a physical blow, and Evelyn watched Nathan's entire body go rigid. Watched 8 years of carefully built security suddenly feel as fragile as glass. "What man?" Nathan demanded. "What papers?" "Says his name's Reginald Ashford," Silas said. "Says he's got old survey documents proving the boundary between your land and the old Whitfield claim was drawn up wrong 40 years ago. Says by rights near 3,000 acres of your western pasture belongs to him." Nathan's face went pale, then hard, then something colder and more dangerous than Evelyn had ever seen on him before. "That's impossible," he said. "This land has been surveyed and confirmed a dozen times over." "He's got papers, boss. Official-looking ones. He's already talking to the town council. Says he plans to file a formal claim with the Territorial Land Office by week's end." Nathan turned back toward the house, toward Evelyn, standing frozen in the kitchen doorway, and for just a moment before the mask of hardened control settled back over his features, she saw real fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who had spent 8 years building something out of nothing, only to watch it threatened by forces entirely beyond his control. "I have to go into town," Nathan said. "Now, tonight." "I'll have your horse ready," Silas said, already turning to go. Nathan grabbed his coat, moving with the sharp, controlled urgency of a man forcing himself not to panic. And as he reached the door, he paused, looking back at Evelyn one final time. "Stay here," he said. "Whatever happens, stay here and keep the household running. I don't know how long I'll be." "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said quietly, and something in her steady certainty seemed to anchor him for just a moment before he disappeared out into the darkening evening, the sound of his horse's hooves fading rapidly down the long dirt road toward town. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, her heart pounding, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. The letters, the confession, the fragile new tenderness that had bloomed between them in the space of a single evening. And now this sudden, terrifying threat rising up out of nowhere to swallow everything Nathan had spent his whole adult life building. She didn't know who this Reginald Ashford was. She didn't know if his claim held any truth to it at all. But she knew one thing with absolute unshakable certainty as she stood there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the door Nathan had just disappeared through. Whatever was coming for Nathan Cole, whatever threatened to tear apart everything he'd built with his own 2 hands, she wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen without a fight. Not after everything she'd already survived to get here. Not after finally finding a reason, however fragile, however new, to believe that maybe, just maybe, some broken things really could be rebuilt. The night stretched on, long and uncertain, and somewhere out there in the darkness, a stranger named Reginald Ashford was preparing to make a claim that would threaten not just Nathan Cole's land, but everything Evelyn had begun quietly and carefully to hope for. And neither Nathan nor Evelyn yet knew just how deep the roots of this threat truly ran, or how much more it would cost them both before the truth finally came to light. Nathan rode into Silver Creek with his jaw set so tight it ached, and by the time he reached the town hall, half the county seemed to already be gathered outside it, lanterns bobbing in the dark. Voices low and buzzing with the particular excitement people reserve for another man's disaster. He pushed through the crowd and found Reginald Ashford standing on the steps of the town hall like he owned them, a slim leather case tucked under one arm, a smile on his face that Nathan distrusted before the man had said a single word. "Mr. Cole," Ashford said smoothly, extending a hand Nathan didn't take. "I was hoping we'd have the chance to speak before this became a spectacle." "Then you shouldn't have brought it to a town hall full of witnesses," Nathan said. "What exactly are you claiming?" Ashford's smile didn't waver. He opened the leather case and produced a folded document, handling it with the careful reverence of a man presenting something he knew was valuable. "A survey," Ashford said, "conducted in 1847, 40 years ago, before your family ever purchased this land. It shows the boundary between the old Whitfield claim and what is now your western pasture was drawn incorrectly. By my calculation, and by the calculation of the surveyor, I've retained nearly 3,000 acres of what you currently call your land was never legally yours to begin with. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Nathan felt the eyes on him, felt the weight of a decade of successes and failures pressing down on this one moment, and he forced his voice to stay level, even as something cold and furious churned in his gut. "That's a lie," Nathan said. "It's a document, Mr. Cole. Documents don't lie. People do." Ashford's smile sharpened at the edges. "I'd be happy to resolve this quietly as gentlemen, rather than dragging it through the territorial courts. I'm a reasonable man." "What does reasonable look like to you?" "A generous settlement. Say $4,000 and I withdraw my claim entirely, or we let a judge in Helena decide, which could take a year, maybe 2, and in the meantime that western pasture becomes contested land. No grazing, no fencing, no use of it at all until the courts settle the matter." Ashford spread his hands as if he were doing Nathan a favor. "I'd rather not see good grazing land sit idle that long. Would you?" The crowd's murmuring grew louder, and Nathan could hear names being whispered. Could hear the particular tone people used when they were already deciding what side of a story to believe, before all the facts existed. "I want to see the original survey," Nathan said. "Not your copy. The original filed with the Territorial Land Office." Ashford's smile flickered just barely, just long enough for Nathan to catch it. "That can be arranged," Ashford said, "though it may take some time to retrieve from the archives in Helena." "Then I suggest you retrieve it quickly," Nathan said, "because until I see it with my own eyes, I'm not paying you a single dollar, and I'm not surrendering a single acre." He turned and walked away before Ashford could answer, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the whispers that followed him, like a cloud of gnats he couldn't swat away. Behind him he heard Ashford's voice carry pitched just loud enough for the crowd to catch every word. "A shame," Ashford said to no one in particular, to everyone at once. A man with nothing to hide usually doesn't refuse to negotiate. Nathan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't turn back. He'd learned a long time ago that giving people like Ashford a reaction was exactly what they wanted. He rode home in the dark with his mind racing, turning over every possible angle, every possible weakness in Ashford's claim, and by the time he reached the ranch gate, he'd made a decision. He wasn't going to fight this alone. Evelyn was waiting up when he returned, sitting near the low fire in the parlor, a lamp burning on the table beside her, and something in Nathan's chest loosened slightly at the sight of her, though he didn't have the words yet to name what that feeling was. "Well?" she asked, standing immediately. "He's claiming 3,000 acres of the western pasture," Nathan said, dropping into the chair across from her, exhaustion settling into every line of his body. "Says there was a survey error 40 years ago. Wants $4,000 to make it disappear, or he takes it to the territorial courts." "Do you believe him?" "No." Nathan rubbed a hand over his face. "But I don't have proof he's lying yet either. He wouldn't show me the original document. Said it would take time to retrieve from Helena." Evelyn sat back down slowly, her mind already working through the problem with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "If the survey was real," she said, "he'd have brought it with him already, wouldn't he? A man confident in his claim doesn't need time to produce proof. He produces it immediately because it strengthens his position." Nathan looked up at her, something sharpening in his exhausted eyes. "That's exactly what I was thinking," he said. "He's stalling. Or he's waiting for something," Evelyn said. "Time to forge something more convincing. Or time to pressure you into settling before anyone can verify his claim at all." Nathan was quiet for a moment, watching her, and something in his expression shifted something like genuine surprise. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like someone who's had to fight for everything I've ever kept," Evelyn said simply. "When my husband died, his employer tried to claim Thomas owed him money for the horse that killed him. Tried to take what little we had left to cover the debt. I spent 2 months proving that horse had a documented history of throwing riders before Thomas ever climbed on it. I learned quickly that people count on grief and exhaustion to make you give up before you fight. Nathan stared at her for a long moment, something in his chest aching with a mixture of admiration and quiet fury on her behalf. "You never told me that," he said. "You never asked." Evelyn said echoing words she'd said to him just hours earlier, though this time there was no sharpness in it, just simple truth laid bare between two people slowly learning how to be honest with each other. "I'm asking now," Nathan said quietly. "Tell me. All of it." Evelyn hesitated, and for a moment, Nathan thought she might refuse, might retreat behind the same careful walls she usually kept as guarded as his own. Instead, she took a slow breath and began to speak, and for the next hour sitting by the low fire, while the rest of the ranch slept. Evelyn told Nathan Cole the whole story of her life. Her mother's death, her father's accident, meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 20. The small farm they'd tried to build together, the years of hard work that never quite paid off Thomas's final desperate decision to take a dangerous job breaking horses for extra money. The day a rancher's boy came riding to tell her Thomas had been thrown and wasn't getting up. She told him about the 2 months fighting Thomas's employer, about winning that fight only to realize winning hadn't brought Thomas back, only ensured she wasn't left with nothing on top of everything else she'd lost. She told him about selling the farm, about moving into the small room above the seamstress shop, about the slow, grinding poverty of trying to survive on seamstress wages in a town that had too many widows and not enough work to go around. Nathan listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finally finished, the fire had burned low and the night had grown deep and quiet around them. "I'm sorry," Nathan said finally, "for everything you've lost." "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Evelyn said. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think it's time we stopped being so careful with each other." Nathan nodded slowly, something settling in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to trust. "Then let me be honest with you," he said. "I'm scared, Evelyn. Not of losing the land itself. I could survive losing 3,000 acres. I built this ranch from 400 acres once before. I could do it again." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "I'm scared because everything I have, everything I am, is tied up in this ranch. If I lose it, I don't know what's left of me underneath it." "There's a man underneath it," Evelyn said quietly. "The same man who rode 6 miles beside an injured boy. The same man who pays his hands fairly and never raises his voice over an honest mistake. The land didn't make you that man, Nathan. You were already him before you owned a single acre." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. "I don't know how you keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Seeing something in me that I stopped being able to see in myself a long time ago." Evelyn reached across the small distance between their chairs and took his hand the same way she had earlier that evening, and this time Nathan didn't hesitate at all before he let his fingers close around hers. "We'll figure this out," Evelyn said. "Together. Starting tomorrow." The next morning, Nathan sent word to the one man in Silver Creek he trusted with legal matters, a sharp, aging attorney named Walter Griggs, who had handled Nathan's land deeds and contracts for nearly a decade. Griggs arrived by midday, a thin, precise man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a leather satchel full of carefully organized documents. "Show me everything you have on this property," Griggs said, settling into Nathan's office. "Every deed, every survey, every piece of paper connected to that western pasture." Nathan spent the next several hours pulling documents from his files, while Evelyn brought coffee and quietly listened from the doorway, absorbing every detail, every legal term, filing it away with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "Here," Griggs said, finally tapping a document with a thin finger. "Your original deed filed in 1861, when your father purchased this land. It references a survey conducted that same year, which would have superseded any earlier survey from 1847, assuming Ashford's document is even real." "So if his survey is legitimate," Nathan said, "it would have been overridden by my father's survey anyway." "Potentially," Griggs said carefully. "It depends on how the original boundary dispute, if there was one, was resolved at the time." I'll need to send for the territorial land office records myself. If Ashford's document has been sitting in an archive somewhere for 40 years, there should be a paper trail confirming its authenticity, its filing date, its chain of custody. If there isn't, then it's forged, Evelyn finished from the doorway. Griggs looked up mildly, surprised to find her contributing to the conversation, though Nathan simply nodded, unsurprised by now at how quickly Evelyn's mind moved through a problem. Precisely, Griggs said. Forged documents typically have gaps in their provenance, no record of filing, no witnesses who can attest to the original survey. If Ashford can't produce a clean paper trail, his claim falls apart entirely. How long will it take to get those records from Helena? Nathan asked. 2 weeks, perhaps 3, if I send a rider immediately and pay for expedited handling. Griggs closed his satchel with a decisive snap. In the meantime, Nathan, I strongly advise you not to negotiate with this man, not to offer any settlement, and not to concede a single acre. The moment you offer money, you signal weakness, and men like Ashford smell weakness, the way vultures smell death. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I won't negotiate, he said. But that evening, as Griggs rode back toward town, a new problem arrived at the ranch gate, one that would prove far more dangerous than Nathan Cole had anticipated. A young ranch hand came sprinting up from the western pasture breathless, his face pale with alarm. Boss, you need to come quick. There's men out there, strangers putting up fence posts along the ridgeline, right through the middle of the grazing land. Nathan was on his horse before the boy finished speaking, riding hard toward the western pasture with Silas and 2 other hands close behind him, and Evelyn watched him go from the porch, her heart pounding with a dread she couldn't quite name. When Nathan reached the ridge, he found exactly what the boy had described. 4 strangers hired hands, by the look of their unfamiliar faces, driving wooden posts into the ground along a line that cut straight through land Nathan had grazed his cattle on for 15 years. What in God's name do you think you're doing? Nathan demanded, swinging down from his horse. One of the men, older, clearly in charge of the crew, straightened up and wiped sweat from his brow. Mr. Ashford hired us to mark the disputed boundary, the man said. Says it's within his rights while the claim's being investigated. He has no rights to this land, Nathan snapped. Not until a court says otherwise. That ain't what he told us, the man said, shrugging unbothered. He's got a letter from a judge in Helena saying the boundary can be provisionally marked pending investigation. You want to argue about it, you can argue with the judge. Show me this letter. The man produced a folded document from his coat, and Nathan snatched it, scanning it quickly, his fury growing with every line. The letter was signed by a Judge Aldous Whitmore, granting provisional authority to mark the disputed boundary, while the survey claim was investigated. Nathan had never heard the name before in his life. This judge doesn't preside over any court I've ever dealt with, Nathan said slowly, something cold settling into his stomach. What court is he attached to? Territorial court, I reckon, the man said, though uncertainty flickered across his face for the first time. That's what Mr. Ashford told us. Nathan folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat. I'm keeping this, he said. You and your men are leaving my land right now, and if you put one more post in this ground, I'll have every one of you arrested for trespassing provisional authority or not. The men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for actual confrontation, and after a tense moment, they began gathering their tools without further argument, riding off toward town, without a backward glance. Nathan stood alone on the ridge for a long moment, staring at the 4 half-driven fence posts jutting crookedly out of the earth, the first physical intrusion onto land that had been his family's for a generation. By the time he returned to the ranch house, dusk had settled deep purple over the mountains, and Evelyn was waiting on the porch, her face tight with worry. What happened? She asked immediately. Nathan handed her the letter without a word, and she read it quickly, her brow furrowing. Judge Aldous Whitmore, she murmured. I've never heard that name before either. Neither have I, Nathan said. And I've lived in this territory my whole life. Griggs will know, Evelyn said, or he'll know how to find out. Nathan nodded, but something else was gnawing at him. Something he couldn't quite articulate yet. A feeling that this entire situation was far more elaborate than a simple boundary dispute, that Ashford had planned this with a level of care and preparation that suggested he'd been planning it for a very long time. "Evelyn," Nathan said slowly, "how would a man even know to target this specific piece of land? The western pasture isn't marked differently from any other part of my property. There's no obvious reason someone would single it out unless they'd studied my deeds very carefully beforehand." Evelyn's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. "Unless someone told him exactly where to look," she said. The implication hung heavy in the evening air between them. "Someone who knows this ranch," Nathan said slowly. "Someone who's had access to my papers, or at least enough information to know where the vulnerabilities in my land claims might exist." "Who would have that kind of access?" Evelyn asked. Nathan's mind raced through the possibilities, his ranch hands unlikely, most of them barely literate and entirely loyal after years of fair treatment. Griggs impossible. The man had represented Nathan faithfully for a decade and had far more to lose than gain from betraying him. Then a name surfaced unbidden, uncomfortable, a name Nathan hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. "Charlotte," he said quietly. Evelyn went very still. "Your former fiancée. She knew this land as well as I did back when we were together. She knew every boundary, every survey marker, everything about how this ranch was assembled." Nathan's voice grew harder, colder. "But she left 8 years ago. I haven't spoken to her since. Why would she suddenly resurface now, trying to take my land?" "Maybe she wouldn't," Evelyn said carefully. "But maybe her husband would. You said she married a merchant in Bozeman. Merchants deal with land speculators all the time. If Ashford is connected to Bozeman somehow, then he could have learned everything he needed to know about this property from Charlotte herself, without her even realizing what her information would be used for." Nathan finished, his stomach turning at the thought. "We need to find out who Ashford really is," Evelyn said. "Where he's from, who he's worked with, whether there's any connection to Bozeman or to Charlotte at all." "I'll send word to Griggs first thing tomorrow," Nathan said. "Have him dig into Ashford's background along with verifying the survey documents." But the next morning brought a complication neither of them had anticipated. A young boy delivered a note to the ranch house just after sunrise, sealed with wax and addressed simply to Mr. Nathan Cole. And when Nathan opened it, his face went pale as he read the contents. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, watching the color drain from his face. Nathan handed her the note without speaking. "Mr. Cole, I understand you've been asking questions about my background and my legal authority. I find this deeply unfortunate, as I had hoped we could resolve our disagreement as gentlemen. Perhaps it's time you understood the full scope of what's at stake here. I am prepared to reveal publicly, if necessary, certain details about your personal arrangements with the woman currently residing in your household. A widow, unmarried, living unchaperoned under your roof for months now. I imagine the good people of Silver Creek would find such an arrangement quite scandalous, regardless of whatever business justification you might offer. I would hate for Miss Harper's reputation to suffer unnecessarily on account of your stubbornness regarding a simple land dispute. $4,000 would resolve everything quite neatly, and no one need know anything more than that a fair transaction took place between two businessmen. I await your reconsideration. R. Ashford." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading, and when she looked up at Nathan, fury had replaced the fear in her eyes. "He's threatening to destroy my reputation," she said, "to force you into paying him. He won't get away with this." Nathan set his voice low and dangerous, in a way Evelyn had never heard from him before. "Nathan, if this becomes public, if the town starts believing there's something improper happening under this roof—" "There's nothing improper happening under this roof," Nathan said firmly, "and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me directly. That's not how reputation works for a woman, Nathan." Evelyn said something old and weary, entering her voice. "It doesn't matter what's actually happening. It only matters what people choose to believe. I've seen women's lives ruined by rumors far less damning than what Ashford's threatening to spread." Nathan's jaw tightened, torn between fury at Ashford and a rising fear that Evelyn might be right, that this threat could hurt her, regardless of the truth. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, thinking, and when she finally spoke, her voice had steadied into something resolute. "We don't give him a single dollar," she said. "If we pay him now over this threat, we're confirming we have something to hide, and it only invites more threats later. We fight this the right way. We prove his land claim is fraudulent, and if he tries to spread rumors about me in the meantime, we deal with that separately, honestly, by simply telling the truth to anyone who asks." Nathan studied her for a long moment, something like awe moving across his features. "You're not afraid of him," he said. "I'm terrified of him," Evelyn corrected. "But I've learned that giving into threats never actually makes them stop, Nathan. It only teaches the person threatening you that threats work. I'd rather face whatever rumors he spreads with my head held high than spend the rest of my life wondering what he might demand next." Nathan reached out and took her hand, the gesture natural, now comfortable in a way it hadn't been just days before. "We'll face it together," he said. Word of the land dispute spread through Silver Creek like wildfire over the following days, and just as Evelyn had feared, whispers about her living arrangement began circulating alongside it, carried by the same gossiping voices that had once whispered about Nathan's failed engagements. "I heard she's not even properly employed," Evelyn overheard one woman say to another, outside the general store, unaware or uncaring that Evelyn stood just close enough to hear every word. "Just living up there with him unmarried, no chaperone in sight. What decent woman would agree to such an arrangement?" "Maybe she's not so decent," the other woman replied, and Evelyn felt her face burn with humiliation, though she forced herself to keep walking, to keep her chin high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply their words cut. That evening, Evelyn found herself staring at her own reflection in the small cracked mirror in her room, seeing not the capable, steady woman she'd worked so hard to become, but suddenly, unwantedly, the frightened widow she'd been just months before, vulnerable to a world that seemed determined to punish her simply for trying to survive. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, and Nathan stepped inside, hesitating at the threshold in a way that suggested he understood the weight of entering her private space even now, even after everything they'd shared. "I heard what happened in town," he said quietly. "Silas told me." Evelyn didn't turn around immediately, still watching her own reflection in the mirror. "It's exactly what I predicted," she said. "The rumors have already started, and Ashford hasn't even followed through on his threat yet. This is just the town's own imagination at work." "I'm sorry," Nathan said. "This is happening because of me, because of my land, my past, my enemies." "It's happening because of Ashford," Evelyn corrected, finally turning to face him. "You didn't create the situation, Nathan. A greedy, manipulative man did. I could still fix it," Nathan said slowly, something careful and deliberate entering his voice. "There's one way to end the rumors entirely. One way to make sure no one can question the propriety of your living here." Evelyn's breath caught, understanding immediately what he was suggesting, though neither of them said the word out loud. "Nathan, don't," she said quietly. "Don't offer marriage as a solution to a scandal. I won't accept it that way. I won't be your seventh." She paused, correcting herself with a bitter, humorless laugh. "Your eighth attempt at proving to this town that you're capable of keeping a wife, especially not out of obligation to protect my reputation." "That's not why I'm—" "Isn't it?" Evelyn interrupted, though her voice was gentle, not accusing. "Nathan, I care about you. More than I expected to. More than I think either of us anticipated when I first arrived at your gate. But I won't build something as important as a marriage on the foundation of a scandal we're trying to escape. If we ever reach that point, and I hope quietly, secretly, that we might someday, I need it to be because you chose me freely, not because circumstances forced your hand." Nathan stared at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Respect and disappointment and a strange kind of relief all tangled together. "You're right," he finally admitted. "I don't want you to be my solution to a problem, Evelyn. I want you to be my choice, freely made when the time is right. Then let's fight the actual problem, Evelyn said. Ashford, his fraudulent claim, his threats. Let's focus on defeating him honestly and let everything else follow in its own time. Nathan nodded slowly, something settling more firmly into place between them, and understanding neither of them needed to speak aloud again. 3 days later, Walter Griggs returned to the ranch with news that changed everything. "I found something," Griggs said, spreading documents across Nathan's desk, with barely contained excitement. "I sent inquiries to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, and there is no record, none whatsoever, of any survey conducted in 1847 covering this section of land. More importantly," Griggs pulled out another document, tapping it emphatically, "there is no Judge Aldous Whitmore currently serving or having ever served on any territorial court in Montana. The name doesn't exist in any judicial record I could find." "He fabricated the entire thing," Nathan said, a slow, cold fury building in his chest. "It appears so," Griggs confirmed. "The survey document Ashford showed you is almost certainly forged, likely created recently despite its aged appearance, and the judicial letter authorizing the boundary marking is entirely fictitious." "Can we prove this in court?" Evelyn asked, standing near the doorway as she always did during these conversations, absorbing every detail. "We can certainly present this evidence," Griggs said, "but proving fraud conclusively will require identifying who actually created these forged documents. Without that, Ashford could simply claim the documents were given to him in good faith by someone else, distancing himself from direct culpability." "Then we find out who forged them," Nathan said firmly. Griggs hesitated, glancing between Nathan and Evelyn with visible unease. "There's something else," Griggs said slowly. "I made some inquiries about Reginald Ashford's background, given the concerns you raised about a possible connection to Bozeman. I discovered that Ashford has in fact done business with a merchant in Bozeman on several previous occasions." Nathan's stomach tightened. "What merchant?" Griggs consulted his notes, though Nathan could tell from the older man's careful expression that he already knew this news would land hard. "A man named Wendell Marsh," Griggs said, "married to a woman named Charlotte." The room fell utterly silent. Evelyn's eyes moved immediately to Nathan, watching the news land, like a physical blow, watching 8 years of buried grief and betrayal rise back to the surface all at once. "Charlotte's husband," Nathan said slowly, each word deliberate, controlled, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Charlotte's husband is working with Ashford. I can't confirm the exact nature of their business relationship yet," Griggs said carefully. "It's possible it's entirely unrelated to this land dispute. But given the timing, given the specific knowledge required to target this particular section of your property—" "It's not a coincidence," Nathan said, his voice hard as flint. Evelyn crossed the room and stood beside him, close enough that her presence felt like an anchor holding him steady against the storm rising inside him. "We need to find out exactly what Charlotte and her husband know," Evelyn said, "and exactly how much of this scheme they're actually involved in versus how much Ashford has simply used information he gathered secondhand." "I'll write to her," Nathan said suddenly, the decision forming even as he spoke it aloud. "Nathan, I have to Evelyn. If she's involved in this, I need to know. If her husband is using information, she gave him information about my land, about my life, I need to hear it from her directly." His jaw tightened. "I owe myself that much closure after 8 years." Evelyn studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the old wound, reopening any indication that reaching out to Charlotte might undo the fragile progress he'd made. "All right," she said finally. "But you're not doing this alone. Whatever you decide to say to her, whatever she says back, I want you to know I'll be here." Nathan looked at her, something fierce and grateful moving through his chest. "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I can do this at all." That night, Nathan sat alone in his office long after the house had gone quiet, a blank sheet of paper in front of him, an inkwell open beside it, and for the first time in 8 years, he found himself writing Charlotte Reyes's name at the top of a letter. He wrote 3 drafts before he settled on words that felt honest without being cruel, direct without being desperate. Charlotte, I've learned that your husband has been conducting business with a man named Reginald Ashford, who is currently attempting to claim 3,000 acres of my land, using documents I have strong reason to believe are fraudulent. Given the specific and detailed knowledge required to target this particular section of my property knowledge that very few people outside our former relationship would possess, I feel compelled to ask you directly, what do you know about this scheme, and what role, if any, has information from our past together played in it? I'm not writing to reopen old wounds between us. I'm writing because I need the truth plainly stated so that I can protect what I've built with my own hands over the past 8 years. Nathan. He sealed the letter and set it aside for morning delivery, and when he finally climbed the stairs toward his bedroom, well past midnight, he found Evelyn still awake, sitting in the hallway on a small wooden chair, clearly waiting for him. "You didn't have to wait up," he said softly. "I wanted to," Evelyn said. "How did it go?" "I sent it," Nathan said. "Whatever happens now is out of my hands." Evelyn stood and reached for his hand, the gesture now as natural between them as breathing. "Whatever she says," Evelyn said quietly, "it doesn't change what you've built since she left Nathan. It doesn't change who you've become despite everything that happened." "I know that now," Nathan said, and he realized with something like wonder that he meant. It truly meant it in a way he hadn't been capable of believing just weeks earlier. The response from Charlotte arrived 4 days later, and its contents would prove far more damning and far more complicated than either Nathan or Evelyn had anticipated. But that revelation and everything it would set into motion was still 4 long days away. And in the meantime, Silver Creek's rumors continued to spread. Ashford's fraudulent fence posts continued appearing along the disputed boundary, despite Nathan's warnings. And somewhere in the shadows of this carefully constructed scheme, someone far more dangerous than Reginald Ashford was quietly watching every move Nathan Cole made, waiting for the perfect moment to strike a blow far more devastating than a simple land dispute ever could. Charlotte's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by the same young boy who'd brought Ashford's threats days before, and Nathan's hands weren't quite steady when he broke the seal. Evelyn stood nearby, close enough to catch him if the words inside proved as devastating as they both feared, but far enough to give him the dignity of reading it first alone before deciding what to share. Nathan read it once quickly, his face draining of color. Then he read it again slower, and when he finally looked up, something had shifted in his expression, something between fury and vindication. "Read it," he said, handing the letter to Evelyn without further explanation. "Nathan, I won't pretend your letter didn't shake me. I've thought of you often over these years, more than my husband would likely appreciate, and I've carried guilt about how things ended between us long after I told myself I'd made peace with it. I need you to know that I did not knowingly participate in whatever scheme is being run against you. But I cannot claim complete innocence either, and I owe you honesty even now, especially now. 2 years ago, Wendell began asking me questions about my past, about the ranch, about you specifically. He said he was simply curious about the life I'd left behind. I told him things I shouldn't have, details about the property boundaries, about the old Whitfield claim dispute your father mentioned once at dinner years before we ever separated. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It felt like harmless conversation between a husband and wife. I recently learned that Wendell has been in business with a man named Reginald Ashford for several months, engaged in what Wendell described vaguely as land opportunities in various territories. When I confronted him after receiving your letter, he grew defensive and refused to explain further, which has only confirmed my worst suspicions. Nathan, I believe my husband gave Ashford the information needed to construct this fraudulent claim against you using details I unknowingly provided him. I am deeply sorry. Whatever damage this causes, you know that it was never my intention, and I will testify to what I know if it helps you prove Ashford's claim is built on lies. I hope you've found happiness since I left. You deserve it more than I ever gave you credit for at the time. Charlotte. Evelyn lowered the letter slowly, her mind already working through the implications. She's willing to testify, Evelyn said. That could be enough to destroy Ashford's entire claim. If she actually follows through, Nathan said. If Wendell doesn't pressure her into silence first. We need Griggs, Evelyn said. Immediately. Griggs arrived within the hour, and after reading Charlotte's letter twice, he sat back in his chair with the first genuine smile Evelyn had seen cross his face since this ordeal began. This is exactly what we need, Griggs said. If Mrs. Marsh testifies that her husband solicited private information about your property specifically to construct a fraudulent claim, combined with our evidence that no legitimate 1847 survey exists, and no Judge Whitmore has ever presided over any territorial court, Ashford's entire case collapses. How quickly can we act on this? Nathan asked. I'll need to travel to Bozeman myself, Griggs said, to secure Mrs. Marsh's sworn testimony before her husband has the opportunity to intimidate her out of providing it. I can leave within the hour if you can spare a horse. Take whatever you need, Nathan said immediately. But before Griggs could even stand from his chair, the sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices erupted from outside the house, and moments later, Silas burst through the front door, his face flushed with alarm. Boss, you need to see this, Silas said, breathless. There's smoke coming up from the eastern line shack, a lot of it. Nathan was on his feet instantly, every instinct sharpening into focus. Fire. Looks that way, Silas said. And Boss Tommy was out there this morning checking on that herd we moved after the storm. He hasn't come back yet. The blood drained from Nathan's face. Get every hand mounted now, Nathan said, already moving toward the door. Buckets, shovels, whatever we've got. Move. Evelyn grabbed his arm before he could disappear entirely. Be careful, she said, her voice tight with fear she didn't bother hiding. I will, Nathan said, and for just a moment, his hand covered hers where it gripped his arm, a silent promise passing between them before he tore himself away and sprinted toward the barn. The ride to the eastern line shack took nearly 20 minutes at a hard gallop, and by the time Nathan and his men arrived, black smoke was billowing thick into the afternoon sky, the small wooden structure fully engulfed flames, licking hungrily at what remained of the roof. Tommy! Nathan shouted, swinging down from his horse, before it had even fully stopped. Tommy, can you hear me? No answer came, except the roar and crackle of the fire consuming everything in its path. Boss, we can't get close enough, Silas warned, grabbing Nathan's arm as he moved toward the burning structure. That roof's gonna come down any second. He could be inside? Nathan said, his voice raw with a fear that went far beyond simple concern for an employee. The fear of a man who had learned through hard experience exactly how quickly a life could be taken from him without warning. Boss over there. One of the younger hands pointed toward a small rise 100 yards off, and Nathan's heart nearly stopped with relief as he spotted Tommy limping toward them. His shirt torn, his face streaked with soot, but alive, undeniably alive. Nathan reached him first, catching the boy as his legs finally gave out from exhaustion and shock. I'm all right, Tommy gasped, though his voice shook badly. I got out before it really caught, but boss? He grabbed Nathan's sleeve with sudden, desperate urgency. It wasn't an accident. I saw a man near the shack right before the fire started. He poured something out of a can, then lit a match and rode off before I even understood what was happening. I tried to stop the fire myself, but it caught too fast. Nathan went very still. Can you describe him? Tall fella, dark coat. I only saw him for a second before I had to run, but... Tommy hesitated, something flickering across his soot-streaked face. Boss, I think I've seen him before. In town, standing near Ashford. That man causing all the trouble about the land. The implication landed like a physical blow. Ashford hadn't just tried fraud and threats. He'd escalated to arson, willing to burn Nathan's property, willing to risk a young man's life simply to force Nathan into submission. We're done letting this man play games with us, Nathan said, his voice deadly quiet, more dangerous than Evelyn had ever heard it, though she wasn't there to hear it, still waiting anxiously back at the main house. By the time Nathan returned that evening, exhausted soot still clinging to his clothes, Evelyn was waiting on the porch, and the moment she saw him safe unharmed, She crossed the distance between them without hesitation and wrapped her arms around him. Something she'd never done before. Something neither of them questioned in that moment. "Tommy's all right," Nathan said into her hair, his own arms coming around her instinctively. "But it wasn't an accident, Evelyn. Someone set that fire deliberately." Tommy saw a man matching Ashford's description near the shack right before it started. Evelyn pulled back slightly, staring up at him with a mixture of fury and fear. "He's willing to burn your property," she said slowly. "To hurt your people. Nathan, this isn't just about land anymore. This man is dangerous." "I know," Nathan said grimly. "Which is exactly why we can't wait for Griggs to slowly build a legal case. We need to move faster." Inside, Griggs was waiting, having postponed his departure to Bozeman upon hearing news of the fire, and his expression was grave as Nathan recounted Tommy's account of the mysterious writer. "Arson is a serious criminal charge," Griggs said. "If we can prove Ashford ordered it or hired someone to commit it, this stops being a simple civil land dispute and becomes a criminal matter entirely. The sheriff would have grounds to arrest him immediately." "Tommy only got a brief look at the man," Nathan said. "It might not be enough for a formal identification." "Then we need more evidence." Evelyn said, her mind already working through the problem with characteristic speed. "Someone in town must have seen this same man. Ashford's been in Silver Creek for over a week now. He's had to hire local men for his fence crew, stay somewhere, eat somewhere. Someone knows more about who's working for him than we currently do. I'll ask around discreetly," Silas offered from the doorway, having followed Nathan back to the house, still covered in soot himself. The men who did his fence work might talk if approached the right way, especially if they didn't know what he was really planning when they signed on. "Be careful," Nathan warned. "If Ashford's willing to burn a line shack and risk Tommy's life, he won't hesitate to hurt anyone who threatens to expose him." Silas nodded grimly and disappeared into the darkening evening, and the house settled into a tense, watchful quiet as everyone waited to see what the coming days would bring. 2 days passed with unbearable slowness, each hour stretched thin with anxious anticipation. And during that time, Nathan found himself watching Evelyn more closely than ever, noticing the careful, quiet strength she brought to every conversation, every decision, every moment of crisis that seemed to keep arriving at his door. On the third evening, Silas returned with information that changed everything. "Found the fellow who did the fence work for Ashford," Silas said, settling into a chair in Nathan's office. Evelyn standing nearby as she always did. Now no longer even questioned for her presence during these discussions. "Name's Duke Halloran. Rough sort, done time in Wyoming for cattle rustling from what I gathered. He didn't want to talk at first, but a few drinks loosened him up considerable." "What did he tell you?" Nathan asked. "Said Ashford's been paying him and 2 other men for more than just fence work. Said Ashford specifically asked if any of them knew how to handle themselves around fire real casual-like a few days before your line shack burned. Duke swears he didn't do it himself, said he wanted no part of arson, but he thinks one of the other 2 men Ashford hired might have taken the job for extra pay." "Would Duke testify to this?" Evelyn asked immediately. Silas hesitated. "That's the tricky part. Duke's scared. Says Ashford threatened all 3 of them, told them, if any word of this got back to you, he'd make sure they took the blame for everything themselves. Arson and fraud, both while he walked away clean, claiming ignorance." Nathan's jaw tightened. Ashford's protecting himself by making sure everyone underneath him is too afraid to talk. Then we need to make Duke less afraid of Ashford than he is of the consequences of staying silent, Evelyn said thoughtfully. "If we can guarantee him some kind of protection or leniency in exchange for testimony, that's a decision for the sheriff and the territorial prosecutor, not us." Griggs interjected, having remained quiet until now. "But it's not unreasonable. If Duke provides testimony that helps convict Ashford of a more serious crime, leniency for his own more minor involvement isn't out of the question." "I'll talk to Sheriff Dawson myself," Nathan said, standing decisively. "Tonight, if he'll see me." Sheriff Dawson, a broad-weathered man who'd kept order in Silver Creek for nearly 15 years, listened to Nathan's account with a deepening frown, and by the time Nathan finished, the sheriff was already reaching for his hat. "Arson's a serious charge in this territory. Dawson said. "If what you're telling me is true and this Duke fella is willing to testify, I can bring Ashford in for questioning immediately. Might not be enough to convict him outright, not without more solid evidence, but it'll rattle him considerable, and rattled men make mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" Nathan asked. "The kind that expose the rest of their scheme," Dawson said grimly. The following morning, Sheriff Dawson arrived at the boarding house where Ashford had been staying, and within the hour, word spread through Silver Creek that Reginald Ashford had been taken in for questioning regarding suspected involvement in the Eastern Line shack fire. The town's reaction was immediate and telling. The same people who had whispered doubts about Nathan and speculated cruelly about Evelyn's reputation suddenly found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew, and by midday, the tide of public opinion had begun slowly but unmistakably to shift. But Ashford, it turned out, was far more prepared for this contingency than anyone had anticipated. "He's got an alibi," Dawson reported grimly when he rode out to the ranch that evening, exhaustion evident in every line of his weathered face. 3 witnesses swearing he was having dinner with them at the hotel restaurant the entire afternoon the fire started. Respectable folks, too, a traveling salesman and 2 local merchants. Says Duke Halloran's just a disgruntled former employee trying to cause trouble after Ashford refused to pay him extra wages he felt entitled to. "That's a lie," Nathan said furiously. "Might be," Dawson agreed, "but I can't arrest a man on the word of one nervous ex-convict against 3 witnesses claiming otherwise, especially when Ashford's lawyer is already threatening to sue for false arrest and defamation if I don't release him by morning." Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. Ashford was slipping through every trap they set for him, always one step ahead, always prepared with an alibi or a legal threat that forced them back onto uncertain ground. "There has to be something more concrete," Evelyn said. "Some piece of evidence that can't be explained away by paid witnesses and clever lawyers." "What about Charlotte's testimony?" Nathan asked. "Griggs was preparing to travel to Bozeman before all this happened with the fire." "That still needs to happen," Griggs said, having remained at the ranch throughout the unfolding crisis, sensing correctly that his legal counsel would be needed constantly in the days ahead. "Perhaps now more urgently than ever. If we can prove the land fraud conclusively through Mrs. Marsh's testimony, it may not directly address the arson charge, but it destroys Ashford's original claim entirely. And a man exposed as a fraud loses credibility on every other front as well." "Then go," Nathan said. "Tomorrow first thing. I'll send 2 of my hands with you for protection, given everything that's happened." Griggs departed at dawn the next morning, accompanied by Silas and another trusted hand, and the days that followed brought a strange, uneasy calm to the ranch, the kind of stillness that exists before a storm finally breaks. Nathan used the time to reinforce security around the ranch posting hands to watch the property overnight, ensuring no further sabotage could catch them unprepared. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself growing closer to Nathan with each passing day, the crisis somehow stripping away the last of the careful distance they'd maintained since her arrival. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink low over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and violet, Nathan finally spoke the words that had been building inside him for weeks. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. Evelyn turned to look at him, something in his tone catching her immediate attention. "When Charlotte left me," Nathan continued slowly, "I told myself I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me like that again. I built walls so thick I convinced myself nothing could ever break through them. And then you arrived at my gate with nothing but a bag and an old horse, and somehow, without even trying, you found every crack in those walls I thought were impenetrable." Evelyn's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt, sensing he needed to say whatever was coming without stopping. "I don't know when it happened exactly," Nathan said. "Maybe it was the coffee that first night. Maybe it was watching you stand up to an entire town's worth of rumors without flinching. Maybe it was every single moment since you arrived where you proved over and over that you weren't like anyone who came before you." He turned to face her fully, now his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "Evelyn, I think I've fallen in love with you. I know it's complicated, given everything happening with Ashford, given the timing of it all. But I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel it any longer." Evelyn's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and for a moment, she couldn't speak at all, overwhelmed by emotions she'd been carefully guarding since Thomas's death. Emotions she'd genuinely believed she might never feel again. "I love you too." She finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I've known it for weeks now, but I was too afraid to say it out loud, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of losing you the way I lost Thomas." Nathan reached for her hand, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, it felt like something settling into place after years of searching for exactly this. "I'm not going anywhere," Nathan said softly. "Whatever Ashford throws at us, whatever this town whispers, I choose you, Evelyn. Freely, completely, without any doubt remaining in my mind." For a moment, sitting together in the fading evening light, the crisis surrounding them seemed to fade into the background, replaced by something pure and hopeful that neither of them had expected to find again after everything they'd both survived. But that fragile peace shattered abruptly 3 days later, when Griggs returned from Bozeman, his face grim, his news far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. "Mrs. Marsh is willing to testify," Griggs said, settling heavily into a chair in Nathan's office, exhaustion evident in every movement. "But there's a complication neither of us anticipated." "What kind of complication?" Nathan asked, dread already building in his chest. "Wendell Marsh discovered his wife's intention to testify against Ashford before I could secure her sworn statement," Griggs said. "He confronted her apparently violently and forbade her from cooperating with our investigation. When I arrived at their home to formally take her testimony, Charlotte was gone." "Gone where?" Evelyn asked sharply. "Nobody seems to know," Griggs said. "The household staff claims she left suddenly without explanation, taking only a small bag with her. Wendell refused to speak with me at all, threatened legal action if I continued pursuing the matter." Nathan's mind raced through the implications, dark possibilities crowding his thoughts. "Do you think Wendell hurt her?" He asked, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. Old feelings for Charlotte resurfacing, despite everything tangled now with genuine concern for her safety. "I don't know," Griggs admitted. "But given the timing, given how convenient her disappearance is for both Wendell and Ashford, I find it deeply suspicious." Evelyn's mind moved quickly through the tangled web of connections, searching for the thread that might unravel everything. "If Wendell is genuinely partnered with Ashford in this scheme," she said slowly, "then Charlotte's testimony would have destroyed both of them simultaneously. Making her disappear conveniently removes that threat entirely. Are you suggesting Wendell might have done something worse than simply forbidding her from testifying?" Nathan asked, his stomach turning at the implication. "I'm suggesting we need to find her," Evelyn said firmly. "Whatever the truth is, Charlotte deserves to be found safely, and if she has information that could stop Ashford, we need that information before he does something even more dangerous than what's already happened." Nathan nodded slowly, torn between multiple urgent concerns, pulling him in different directions all at once. "I'll send word to Sheriff Dawson," Nathan said. "Ask him to alert authorities in Bozeman about Charlotte's disappearance. Perhaps they can locate her, ensure her safety, and secure whatever testimony she was prepared to give before Wendell interfered." But even as Nathan gave the order, a new and more immediate danger was already unfolding closer to home. Late that same night, long after the household had settled into uneasy sleep, Evelyn woke suddenly to the sound of hushed voices outside her window, voices that didn't belong to any of Nathan's trusted ranch hands. She rose quietly, moving to the window with careful, silent steps, and what she saw in the moonlight made her blood run cold. 2 unfamiliar men stood near the barn, speaking in low, urgent tones. One of them gesturing toward the main house with unmistakable menace, and even from this distance Evelyn could see the glint of a rifle slung across one man's shoulder. She didn't hesitate. She moved immediately to Nathan's room, knocking urgently, her heart hammering with fear that went beyond simple concern for property or reputation, now straight into terror for their actual physical safety. Nathan answered within seconds, already alert, despite the late hour, some instinct honed by years of vigilant ranch ownership, immediately sensing something was deeply wrong. 2 men, Evelyn whispered urgently. "By the barn. One of them's armed." Nathan moved instantly, grabbing his own rifle from beside the bed, his expression hardening into something dangerous and focused. "Stay here," he said. "Lock the door behind me." "Nathan." "Evelyn, please. I need to know you're safe while I handle this." She nodded reluctantly, watching him disappear down the hallway, with a fear so intense it felt like physical pain, and the moment he was gone, she moved to wake Silas and the other hands sleeping in the bunkhouse, refusing to let Nathan face armed intruders alone, regardless of what he'd asked of her. By the time Nathan reached the barn, moving carefully through the shadows with his rifle raised, the two men had noticed the commotion stirring in the house and were already retreating toward horses tethered a short distance away. "Stop right there!" Nathan called out, his voice carrying authority sharpened by genuine danger. "Hands where I can see them!" One of the men spun, raising his own weapon, and for one terrifying moment, Nathan believed he might actually have to fire on another human being for the first time in his life. Then Silas and 3 other hands arrived, rifles raised, and the 2 intruders, faced with overwhelming odds, made the calculated decision to flee rather than fight, disappearing into the darkness before anyone could stop them or clearly identify their faces. Nathan stood breathing hard in the aftermath, adrenaline coursing through his system, and when Evelyn appeared moments later, disregarding his instructions entirely, he pulled her into his arms without hesitation, relief and lingering fear crashing through him simultaneously. "You could have been killed," Evelyn said against his chest, her own voice shaking. "So could you," Nathan said, "if you hadn't woken up, if you hadn't warned me." He didn't finish the thought, couldn't bring himself to imagine what might have happened otherwise. The following morning, Sheriff Dawson investigated the scene and confirmed what everyone already suspected. "These weren't simple thieves," Dawson said grimly, examining tracks near the barn. "Thieves don't come armed with rifles specifically, and they don't retreat this cleanly when confronted. This was something else entirely." "You think Ashford sent them?" Nathan said. "I can't prove it," Dawson admitted. "But given everything else happening around this property lately, I'd say it's a reasonable conclusion. This is escalating fast, Nathan. Fraud, arson, now armed men trespassing on your property in the middle of the night. Whatever Ashford's ultimate goal is, he's getting more desperate and more dangerous by the day." "What do we do?" Evelyn asked, her earlier fear hardening now into fierce determination. "We need something conclusive," Dawson said. "Something that ties Ashford directly and undeniably to these crimes, strong enough evidence that no alibi or paid witness can explain it away." That evening, as the household finally settled into an uneasy, watchful rest after the terrifying events of the previous night, a rider arrived at the ranch gate bearing news that would prove to be the turning point everyone had been desperately searching for. It was a young telegraph operator from town, breathless from his hard ride, clutching a folded telegram that had just arrived from Bozeman. "This came for Mr. Griggs," the boy said, "but he said if anything urgent arrived I should bring it straight here." Nathan took the telegram with hands that weren't entirely steady, and as he read its contents his expression shifted through shock, then something like triumphant relief. "They found Charlotte?" Nathan said, looking up at Evelyn and Griggs, who had gathered close in anticipation. "She's safe. She went into hiding herself, terrified of what Wendell might do if she stayed after their confrontation. She's currently under protection with the Bozeman sheriff, and she's prepared to give her full testimony immediately." "That's wonderful news," Griggs said, relief evident in his voice. "But there's more, isn't there? I can see it in your face." Nathan nodded slowly, reading further down the telegram. "She's also provided information about Wendell's business dealings that goes far beyond what we initially suspected," Nathan said. "According to Charlotte, this isn't Ashford's first fraudulent land scheme. Wendell has apparently helped him orchestrate similar frauds against at least 3 other ranchers across the territory over the past 2 years, always using the same pattern: forged surveys, fabricated judicial documents, and escalating intimidation when the initial fraud attempt meets resistance." The revelation landed heavily across the room. "If that's true," Griggs said slowly, "this isn't simply a civil land dispute anymore. This is evidence of an ongoing criminal conspiracy spanning multiple victims across the territory. That changes everything about how we can pursue this legally." "How so?" Evelyn asked. Territorial prosecutors take conspiracy charges far more seriously than isolated civil disputes, Griggs explained. If Charlotte can identify the other victims, and if they're willing to come forward with their own experiences, we're no longer fighting Ashford alone. We're building a case that could see him imprisoned for years, not simply forced to withdraw a single fraudulent claim. Hope, real and substantial for the first time in weeks, began to take root in the room. When can Charlotte provide this testimony formally? Nathan asked. The telegram indicates she's prepared to travel to Silver Creek herself under sheriff's protection to testify directly before the territorial prosecutor, Griggs said. She should arrive within the week. Nathan felt something complicated stirring in his chest at the thought of seeing Charlotte again after 8 years, after everything that had happened between them. But when he glanced at Evelyn, he found only steady support in her expression. No jealousy, no insecurity, simply quiet strength standing beside him as she always did. "Are you all right with this?" Nathan asked her quietly once Griggs had departed to send word ahead to the territorial prosecutor's office. "Nathan, this isn't about old feelings resurfacing," Evelyn said gently. "This is about justice, about protecting what you've built, about stopping a dangerous man before he hurts anyone else. I trust you completely. I have no reason to fear Charlotte's return." Nathan pulled her close, grateful beyond words, for the steady, unwavering trust she offered him so freely. Trust he was only now beginning to understand he genuinely deserved. But even as hope began building toward what seemed like an inevitable resolution, a darker complication was unfolding just beyond their awareness, one that would test everything they'd built together far more severely than anything Ashford had attempted thus far. 2 days before Charlotte's scheduled arrival, Wendell Marsh himself rode into Silver Creek, and his presence signaled that this conflict was about to reach a breaking point neither Nathan nor Evelyn could have fully anticipated. Wendell requested a private meeting with Nathan, sending word through the hotel clerk that he wished to discuss a matter of mutual interest before Charlotte's testimony could proceed any further. "Don't go alone," Evelyn urged when Nathan announced his intention to meet with the man. "Whatever he wants, it can't be trusted." "I won't be alone," Nathan assured her. Dawson insisted on being present himself given everything that's happened. The meeting took place in a private room at the hotel. Sheriff Dawson, standing watchful near the door, while Nathan faced Wendell Marsh. For the first time in his life, a man who had in some tangled way been connected to his own history for 8 years without either of them ever meeting directly. Wendell was younger than Nathan expected, well-dressed, with the polished, careful manner of a successful merchant, accustomed to negotiating difficult conversations to his own advantage. "Mr. Cole," Wendell said, extending a hand Nathan again declined to take. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me given the circumstances." "You have exactly as much time as it takes me to lose patience," Nathan said flatly. "What do you want?" Wendell's composed expression flickered just slightly, revealing something more desperate beneath the surface. "I want to propose a resolution," Wendell said. "One that avoids further complications for everyone involved, myself, my wife, and yourself." "You mean you want to stop Charlotte from testifying?" Nathan said bluntly. "I mean, I want to prevent unnecessary destruction of multiple lives over a business arrangement that's already going badly enough as it stands." Wendell said, his voice tightening with barely controlled frustration. "Ashford approached me nearly a year ago about various land opportunities across the territory. I'll admit freely that I provided him with information about several properties including yours, without fully understanding the extent of how he intended to use it. I did not authorize arson. I did not authorize armed men trespassing on your property. Those actions were entirely Ashford's own escalation beyond anything I sanctioned or condoned." "That's a convenient distinction," Nathan said coldly, "considering how much profit you likely stood to gain from Ashford's scheme succeeding." Wendell's jaw tightened. "I'm not a violent man, Mr. Cole. I made a poor business decision trusting the wrong partner, and I'm prepared to face consequences for that error. But I'm asking you as one reasonable man to another to consider what exposing this entire conspiracy publicly will actually accomplish. It will destroy my business, ruin my marriage beyond any hope of repair, and expose Charlotte to public humiliation she doesn't deserve for a scheme she had no knowledge of participating in. Nathan studied Wendell carefully, searching for the manipulation he expected to find the same kind of manipulation Ashford had employed throughout this entire ordeal. "What exactly are you proposing?" Nathan asked cautiously. "I'll provide complete detailed testimony against Ashford myself," Wendell said. "Everything I know about his previous schemes against other ranchers, every detail of our business dealings, enough evidence to ensure he faces the full weight of criminal prosecution. In exchange, I'm asking that Charlotte's involvement remain minimized in the official proceedings, treated simply as an unwitting source of information rather than a knowing participant in fraud." Nathan considered this proposal carefully, weighing every angle, every possible motivation behind Wendell's sudden willingness to fully cooperate. "Why should I trust anything you're telling me?" Nathan finally asked. "You've already proven willing to profit from schemes built on stolen information and forged documents. Because I have far more to lose by continuing to protect Ashford than by exposing him completely," Wendell said honestly. "He's become reckless, dangerous, willing to escalate to violence in ways I never anticipated when I first became involved. I want out of this partnership entirely, Mr. Cole, and the only way out that doesn't leave me facing the harshest possible prosecution myself is by providing testimony valuable enough to warrant leniency." Sheriff Dawson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "If Marsh's testimony genuinely helps convict Ashford on multiple counts of fraud, arson, conspiracy, and attempted extortion across several victims," Dawson said, "the territorial prosecutor may well be willing to negotiate reduced charges against him in exchange. That's a decision ultimately above my authority, but it's not unreasonable given how valuable his inside knowledge could prove." Nathan sat with this information for a long moment, torn between his desire for complete justice against everyone involved and the practical recognition that Wendell's cooperation could prove decisive in finally stopping Ashford's dangerous scheme entirely. "I'll need to discuss this with my own legal counsel," Nathan finally said. "And with Charlotte herself once she arrives. This isn't a decision I'll make unilaterally on your behalf." "That's fair." Wendell said, something like genuine relief crossing his features. "I only ask that you consider it seriously." As Nathan rode back toward the ranch that evening, his mind raced through the implications of this unexpected development, and by the time he arrived home, Evelyn was waiting as always, ready to help him work through whatever new complication had arisen. "He wants to cooperate fully," Nathan explained, recounting the entire conversation while Evelyn listened intently. "In exchange for leniency toward Charlotte's involvement." "Do you believe him?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know," Nathan admitted. "But if his testimony helps finally stop Ashford, helps protect other ranchers from suffering the same scheme, maybe it's worth considering, regardless of my personal feelings about the man." Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding the difficult calculation Nathan was working through. "Justice doesn't always look exactly like we imagine it should," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it means accepting an imperfect resolution because it accomplishes the greater good more completely than pursuing perfect punishment for everyone involved." Nathan looked at her, something like gratitude moving through his chest at her steady, clear-eyed wisdom during a moment when his own judgment felt clouded by years of old resentment finally surfacing. "What would you do?" he asked quietly. "I'd let Charlotte decide for herself," Evelyn said. "It's her reputation, her marriage, her future at stake in that negotiation. She deserves the agency to choose how she wants to proceed, rather than having men decide it entirely on her behalf." Nathan nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words immediately. "You're right," he said. As always, 3 days later, Charlotte Reyes Marsh arrived in Silver Creek under Sheriff Dawson's protective escort, and the reunion between her and Nathan, witnessed carefully by Evelyn standing steady at his side, would set into motion the final dramatic confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Nathan's land, but the ultimate reckoning for every lie Reginald Ashford had told in his desperate pursuit of a fortune built on other people's suffering. Charlotte stepped down from the sheriff's carriage, looking older than 8 years should have made her the polish of a merchant's wife, worn thin by fear and sleepless nights. And when her eyes found Nathan standing near the hotel steps, something complicated passed across her face. Guilt, old affection, and a kind of exhausted relief that the waiting was finally over. "Nathan," she said quietly. "Charlotte." His voice was even guarded, but not cruel. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much choice left," she said. "Not after Wendell, not after everything." Evelyn stood a few steps back, close enough to be present, far enough to give them room. And when Charlotte's gaze shifted to her, something like recognition and gratitude moved across the other woman's tired features. "You must be Evelyn," Charlotte said. "Nathan wrote about you. Not by name, but I could tell." "I hope only good things," Evelyn said carefully. "The only kind he had to tell," Charlotte said, and for a moment, something almost like a smile touched her mouth before exhaustion pulled it back down. They moved the conversation indoors to Griggs's small office near the courthouse where the territorial prosecutor, a sharp, unsmiling man named Prosecutor Vance, had traveled in specially from Helena, given the seriousness of the emerging conspiracy charges. Charlotte's testimony, once she finally gave it formal and sworn before witnesses, painted a picture darker than anyone had fully anticipated. "Wendell began working with Ashford almost 2 years ago," Charlotte said. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice steady despite the visible effort it cost her. "At first it was legitimate, or so I believed. Land speculation, buying undervalued properties, reselling them at profit. But 6 months in I noticed the pattern. Every property they targeted had some kind of vulnerability. An aging owner without heirs. A family in debt. A boundary dispute buried in old records nobody had looked at in decades. And you provided information about Nathan's ranch, specifically." Prosecutor Vance set his pen moving steadily across his notes. "Not knowingly, not at first," Charlotte said. "Wendell asked casual questions over months framed as simple curiosity about my past. I mentioned the Whitfield boundary dispute, once something Nathan's father discussed at a dinner years before Nathan and I separated. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't connect it to anything sinister until Nathan's letter arrived." "When did you realize the true scope of what Ashford and your husband were doing?" Vance asked. Charlotte's composure cracked slightly. 3 months ago, I found documents in Wendell's study records of at least 3 other ranches targeted the same way in Wyoming and eastern Montana. Old boundary disputes resurrected with forged surveys. Fabricated judicial authority. Escalating pressure when the owners resisted settlement. She swallowed hard. One rancher, a widow near Bozeman, actually paid the settlement rather than risk a drawn-out fight. She lost nearly $2,000 to a claim that was entirely fraudulent. The room went very still. "Can you provide her name?" Vance asked. "And the names of the other targeted ranchers?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "I copied everything I found before Wendell discovered I'd been looking. That's partly why I ran. I was afraid of what he might do once he realized how much I actually knew." Nathan's jaw tightened old anger, and something like protective instinct warring inside him despite everything. "Did he threaten you?" Charlotte hesitated, and that hesitation told Nathan everything he needed to know before she even answered. "He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise it," she said quietly. "Told me if I said anything to anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it. That's when I decided I couldn't stay in that house any longer." Evelyn's hand found Nathan's under the table, a silent reminder to stay steady, to let the process work, rather than let old feelings pull him toward reckless anger. Prosecutor Vance leaned forward. "Mrs. Marsh, if you're willing, this documentation you copied combined with your sworn testimony today could be enough to charge both your husband and Mr. Ashford with conspiracy to commit fraud across multiple counties, in addition to whatever charges apply specifically to the arson and trespassing here in Silver Creek." "I understand," Charlotte said. "I'll provide everything I have." "There is one more matter," Vance said carefully. "Your husband has offered cooperation in exchange for leniency regarding your own involvement. Given what you've told me today, and given the evidence you're providing voluntarily, I'm inclined to view your role as that of an unwitting source rather than a knowing conspirator. But I want to be direct with you, some negative attention may still follow you, regardless of the legal outcome. I've already lost my marriage. Charlotte said something steady and resolved, settling into her voice for the first time since she'd arrived. I've already lost the comfortable life I chose over a harder one 8 years ago, when I thought comfort mattered more than anything else. I'd rather lose whatever's left with my head held high than keep protecting a man who used me to hurt people I once loved. Nathan felt something shift in his chest at those words, an old wound finally genuinely closing, rather than simply scarring over. "Thank you, Charlotte," he said quietly, "for telling the truth even when it cost you everything." "It's the least I owe you," Charlotte said. After everything. The formal proceedings took the better part of 2 days. Statements gathered, documents cataloged, additional testimony solicited by telegraph from the other victimized ranchers Charlotte had identified, and by the third morning, Prosecutor Vance was prepared to move against Reginald Ashford with the full weight of territorial law. But Ashford, it seemed, had anticipated exactly this outcome, and by the time Sheriff Dawson arrived at the boarding house to make the arrest, the room stood empty. Ashford's belongings gone, the innkeeper reporting he'd settled his bill and departed on the early stage the previous evening without explanation. "He's running," Dawson said grimly, delivering the news to Nathan and Evelyn at the ranch. "Which tells me he knew Charlotte's testimony was coming, or at least suspected it strongly enough not to risk staying." "Where would he go?" Evelyn asked. "Stage went toward Helena," Dawson said. "But that doesn't mean that's his final destination. A man like Ashford's probably got escape routes planned in more than one direction. We can't just let him disappear," Nathan said, frustration evident in every line of his body. "After everything, after the fire, after nearly getting Tommy killed, after threatening Evelyn's reputation, he just rides away clean. I've wired every sheriff's office between here and Helena with his description," Dawson said. "And Prosecutor Vance is preparing formal warrants that'll follow him regardless of which territory he tries to hide in. Men like Ashford rarely stay hidden forever. Greed always pulls them back into view eventually. But waiting for justice to eventually catch up with a fleeing criminal felt like cold comfort against the damage already done, and Nathan spent that evening pacing his office, unable to settle, unable to feel any real sense of resolution, despite Charlotte's crucial testimony and the mounting case against both Ashford and Wendell. Evelyn found him there well past midnight, staring at nothing, exhaustion and frustration etched into every line of his face. "You should be relieved," she said, gently settling into the chair across from his desk. "Charlotte's testimony destroys his fraudulent claim entirely. Even if he escapes prosecution temporarily, your land is safe. Your name is cleared. The town already knows the truth now." "It doesn't feel like enough," Nathan admitted. "He tried to burn my property. He nearly got Tommy killed. He threatened your reputation, sent armed men onto my land in the middle of the night, and now he simply rides away and disappears while I'm supposed to feel satisfied that my land title is secure." I understand," Evelyn said quietly. "But Nathan, sometimes the fight for justice takes longer than we want it to. Sometimes we have to accept partial victory today and trust that the rest will eventually follow, rather than letting the incomplete parts poison everything you've already won." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something in her calm, hard-earned wisdom settling the restless fury in his chest, at least partially. "How did you learn to be this steady?" he asked. "After everything you've lost, how do you still manage to see things so clearly?" "Because falling apart never brought anyone back," Evelyn said simply. "I learned that after my mother died, and again after my father, and again after Thomas. Grief and anger are real, and they deserve to be felt fully. But eventually, you have to choose to keep building something, or the people who hurt you win twice over once, by causing the damage, and again by convincing you nothing good can grow from the wreckage afterward." Nathan reached across the desk and took her hand, something settling more completely into place inside him than any legal victory could have provided. "I don't think I could have survived this the way I have without you," he admitted quietly. You would have survived, Evelyn said. You survived 8 years alone before I ever arrived at your gate. But I'm glad I didn't have to watch you do it alone this time. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, and then Nathan spoke again, his voice carrying a new kind of resolve. When this is finally over, he said, when Ashford is caught, when the last of this mess is cleared away completely, I want to ask you something important. Something I've been thinking about for weeks now. Evelyn's heart quickened, though she kept her voice carefully even. What kind of something? Nathan smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile she'd seen from him in what felt like ages. You'll have to wait and find out. I'm not making the mistake of rushing something this important while we're still in the middle of a crisis. Evelyn laughed softly, a warm, genuine sound that filled the quiet office with something like hope. Fair enough, Mr. Cole. I can wait. 3 days later, word arrived that would bring the entire ordeal crashing toward its final, dangerous conclusion. A telegram arrived from the sheriff's office in Bozeman, forwarded urgently to Silver Creek, reporting that Reginald Ashford had been spotted boarding a train heading toward the Eastern Territories, likely attempting to disappear entirely beyond the reach of Montana's territorial courts. But more alarming than Ashford's attempted escape was a second piece of news buried within the same telegram Wendell Marsh faced with the mounting evidence against him, and the collapse of his partnership with Ashford had suffered some kind of breakdown, reportedly making desperate, incoherent threats against both Charlotte and disturbingly against Nathan himself, before disappearing from his own home in the middle of the night. He's unstable, Dawson said grimly, delivering this news personally to the ranch. And desperate men do desperate things, Nathan. I'd suggest increased caution around your property until we know exactly where Wendell Marsh has gone. Charlotte, who had remained in Silver Creek under Griggs's arrangement while the legal proceedings continued, went pale at this news. He blames me, she said quietly, for all of it. He'll come here looking for me or for Nathan, thinking somehow that hurting one of us will fix what he's already destroyed. You're safe here, Nathan said firmly. Whatever happens, we'll make sure of that. But that promise proved harder to keep than any of them anticipated. 2 nights later, under a moon hidden behind thick storm clouds, a figure moved silently through the darkness surrounding the Cole ranch, and by the time anyone noticed the danger approaching, it was almost too late to stop it. Evelyn woke first, some instinct honed by months of vigilance, sensing something wrong. Before she could identify exactly what and when she moved to the window, she saw a shape moving near the house itself, closer than any of Ashford's hired men had dared to come before. Nathan, she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. Someone's outside, close, too close. Nathan was instantly alert, grabbing his rifle, moving toward the window to confirm what Evelyn had seen, and what he witnessed made his blood run cold. Wendell Marsh stood in the moonlight below, disheveled, clearly not himself, clutching something in his hand that glinted with unmistakable danger even from this distance. Charlotte! Wendell's voice carried up through the night, ragged and desperate. I know you're in there. You destroyed everything, and you're going to answer for it. Charlotte, sleeping in a guest room down the hall, emerged into the corridor, already trembling with fear, having heard her husband's voice through the walls. He's going to hurt someone, she said, her voice shaking badly. Nathan, he's not thinking clearly anymore. I've never heard him sound like this. Stay inside, Nathan said firmly, already moving toward the stairs. Both of you, lock yourselves in and don't come out until I say it's safe. Nathan, please be careful, Evelyn said, catching his arm before he could descend further. Whatever he's holding. I'll be careful, Nathan promised, though the grim set of his jaw suggested he understood exactly how dangerous this confrontation might become. Nathan moved out onto the porch alone, rifle raised but not aimed directly, his voice carrying steady authority despite the danger clearly present in the darkness before him. Wendell, put down whatever you're holding, Nathan said. This doesn't need to go any further than it already has. You don't understand anything, Wendell shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. She destroyed my business, my marriage. Everything I built gone because she couldn't keep her mouth shut about things that weren't her concern. Your own choices destroyed those things, Nathan said carefully, trying to keep the man talking, trying to buy time for Silas and the other hands to circle around from the bunkhouse. Charlotte didn't force you into fraud, Wendell. She didn't force you to threaten her or partner with a man willing to burn property and endanger lives. Shut up! Wendell's voice rose sharply, and Nathan saw him raise the object in his hand. A revolver, unmistakable now in the pale moonlight breaking briefly through the clouds. You don't get to lecture me about choices not from where you're standing safe in your fine house with everything intact, while I've lost absolutely everything. Wendell, please. Charlotte's voice called out suddenly from an upstairs window, having disobeyed Nathan's instruction to stay hidden. This isn't the answer. Hurting Nathan won't fix anything that's already broken. Wendell's aim wavered toward the sound of her voice, and Nathan's heart nearly stopped every instinct screaming to close the distance before the situation deteriorated any further. Wendell, look at me, Nathan said sharply, deliberately, drawing the man's attention and his weapon back toward himself, away from the window where Charlotte stood exposed. You're angry with me. Fine. I understand that. But Charlotte's already given her testimony. Hurting either of us now won't undo any of it. It'll only add murder to everything else you're already facing. For a long, terrifying moment, Wendell stood frozen, the revolver trembling in his unsteady grip, and Nathan watched the man's face cycle through fury, despair, and something that looked disturbingly like resignation. I have nothing left, Wendell said, his voice suddenly hollow, exhausted. Nothing left to lose. That's not true, Nathan said, keeping his voice steady, calm, deliberately reasonable, despite the very real danger of the weapon aimed toward him. You still have a choice right now, Wendell. Put the gun down, and you still have the chance to face what's coming with some measure of dignity and tact. Use it, and you lose even that. Silas and two other hands had circled silently around the far side of the house during this exchange, and just as Wendell's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger, Silas moved fast, tackling the man from behind before he could fire, sending the revolver skittering harmlessly across the dirt. The struggle was brief but intense, Wendell fighting with the desperate strength of a cornered man before the combined weight of 3 ranch hands finally subdued him completely. And within minutes, he lay pinned and sobbing in the dirt. All his fury finally collapsed into raw, broken grief. Nathan stood breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing violently through his system, and when Evelyn came running from the house, despite his earlier instructions, he caught her in his arms, both of them shaking with the aftermath of how close disaster had truly come. You're safe, Evelyn said against his chest, her voice breaking with emotion. You're actually safe. I'm safe, Nathan confirmed, holding her tightly. We're all safe. Sheriff Dawson arrived within the hour, summoned by a rider Nathan had dispatched the moment the confrontation began, and Wendell Marsh was taken into custody, his desperate midnight assault adding attempted murder to the already substantial list of charges building against both him and his fugitive partner. This should be enough to keep him held without bail, Dawson said, watching as his deputies loaded Wendell into a wagon bound for the territorial jail. Between tonight's assault and the fraud conspiracy, he won't be walking free again anytime soon. Charlotte stood watching from the porch, tears streaming silently down her face, watching the wreckage of her marriage finally completely collapse into something beyond any hope of repair. I'm sorry, she said quietly when Nathan approached her afterward. For all of this. For bringing this danger to your home, to the people you care about. You didn't bring this danger, Charlotte, Nathan said gently. You survived it, and then you had the courage to tell the truth despite everything it cost you. That's not something you need to apologize for. Charlotte looked up at him, something like genuine peace settling into her exhausted features for what seemed like the first time since her arrival. Thank you, she said, for everything. For not turning me away when I could have brought nothing but more trouble into your life. We're not so different, you and I, Nathan said quietly. We both learned the hard way that surviving something terrible doesn't mean you stop being worth something afterward. 2 weeks later, news arrived that closed the final chapter on Reginald Ashford's dangerous scheme. He'd been apprehended in Cheyenne attempting to establish a new identity and begin another fraudulent land scheme against unsuspecting ranchers in Wyoming territory, and with Charlotte's documented evidence, Wendell's forced cooperation and testimony from the additional victimized ranchers, She'd identified the case against him, proved overwhelming. Prosecutor Vance secured convictions on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to arson, ensuring Ashford would spend many years in territorial prison, unable to threaten another family's security and safety ever again. Wendell, facing his own substantial charges, accepted a plea agreement that spared him the harshest possible sentence in exchange for complete cooperation testimony that helped ensure Ashford's conviction was airtight and unassailable. The morning the final verdicts arrived by telegraph, Nathan stood on his porch with Evelyn beside him, watching the sun rise gold and clean over land that was finally, completely, undeniably secure. "It's over," Evelyn said softly, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. "It's over," Nathan confirmed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against him. Silver Creek's opinion of Nathan Cole had transformed entirely over the preceding weeks. The same voices that had once whispered cruel speculation about his character and Evelyn's reputation, now speaking with genuine admiration and respect. Having witnessed firsthand the courage and integrity both of them had shown throughout the entire dangerous ordeal. "You know," Nathan said, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in brilliant streaks of gold and rose, "I think it's finally time I asked you that question I mentioned weeks ago." Evelyn turned to look at him, her heart suddenly racing with anticipation. Nathan reached into his coat pocket, and what he withdrew made Evelyn's breath catch entirely in her throat. But before he could speak another word, before he could offer whatever question had clearly been building inside him through every dangerous night of the preceding weeks, the sound of an approaching rider interrupted the moment entirely, carrying news that would prove to be the final unexpected piece of this long and complicated story. One final revelation neither Nathan nor Evelyn had anticipated needing to face before they could finally completely move forward into whatever future they chose to build together. The rider pulled up hard at the gate, his horse lathered and blowing, and Nathan slid the small box back into his coat pocket before the man had even swung down from the saddle. "Mr. Cole," the rider called, breathless. "Sheriff Dawson sent me. Says you need to come to town right away. It's about the Whitfield claim records." Nathan felt Evelyn's hand tighten around his arm. "What about them?" Nathan asked. "Clerk found something going through the old land office archive cross-referencing Ashford's case," the rider said. "Something about your father. Says it's better you hear it from Dawson directly than from me." Nathan and Evelyn exchanged a glance, the same unspoken question passing between them. After everything, the fraud, the fire, the armed men in the night, Wendell's desperate collapse, what more could possibly be waiting to surface? They rode into town within the hour, and Sheriff Dawson met them outside his office, with an expression Nathan couldn't quite read, something caught between apology and reluctant honesty. "There's no easy way to say this," Dawson said, "so I'll just say it. Going through the archive records tied to Ashford's forged survey, the clerk found the real 1847 survey. The genuine one filed and forgotten, buried under 40 years of paperwork, nobody ever bothered to dig up. And?" Nathan asked, his stomach tightening. "And it turns out the boundary was drawn wrong," Dawson said quietly. "Not the way Ashford claimed, not 3,000 acres, nothing that dramatic. But there's an 80-acre strip along the creek that legally belongs to the old Whitfield family, not to your father's original purchase. Whitfield's last living descendant is a woman named Ruth Whitfield, lives modest over near Bannock. She's got no idea any of this exists." For a moment, the news hit Nathan like a fresh betrayal exhaustion, an old anger flaring up instinctively, the reflexive fury of a man who had just spent weeks fighting off a fraudulent claim only to discover a small, real one hiding underneath it. But then he looked at Evelyn, saw the steady patience in her eyes, and something in him settled before the anger could take root. 80 acres, Nathan repeated slowly. "Creekside land," Dawson confirmed. "Good grazing, but nothing that threatens the ranch as a whole. This isn't Ashford's kind of trouble, Nathan. This is just an old mistake, decades old, that happened to surface because of everything that's been dug up lately." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and Evelyn watched him. Carefully, watched the old Nathan, the guarded one, who might have once seen this as one more unfair blow from a world determined to take what he'd built, wrestle silently with the new Nathan, the one who had learned slowly and painfully that honesty mattered more than winning. "Where can I find Ruth Whitfield?" Nathan finally asked. Dawson blinked clearly, not expecting that response. "You planning on fighting the claim?" "I'm planning on giving her what's legally hers," Nathan said. 80 acres of creek land isn't worth becoming the kind of man who hides behind old paperwork the way Ashford tried to use old paperwork against me. If it's hers, it's hers. Evelyn's hand found his quiet pride shining in her eyes. "That's a rare thing." Dawson said something like genuine respect entering his weathered voice. "A man giving up land willingly instead of fighting for every inch." "I've spent enough of my life fighting for things that didn't actually matter," Nathan said. "I'd rather spend what's left of it doing right by people starting now." Ruth Whitfield turned out to be a quiet widow in her 60s, living in a small, well-kept house on the edge of Bannock with her grown son and his young family. And when Nathan and Evelyn arrived a week later with Griggs and the official survey documents in hand, she listened to the explanation with visible confusion that slowly gave way to disbelief. "You're telling me I own land I never knew existed," Ruth said slowly. "And you're here to tell me that instead of hiding it—" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Nathan confirmed. "The land's yours by rights, Mrs. Whitfield. Has been for 40 years, whether either of us knew it or not." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, though she laughed softly through them, shaking her head in genuine astonishment. "My husband used to say honest men were harder to find than gold in these territories," she said. "I didn't believe him. Guess I owe him an apology wherever he's watching from now." "We'd like to make the transition simple," Griggs said, stepping in with practiced ease. "Mr. Cole is prepared to formally deed the land back to you immediately, along with a fair settlement for the years the creekside grazing was used without your knowledge." Ruth looked between Nathan and Evelyn, something like wonder still lingering on her weathered face. "Most men in your position would have buried this and never said a word," she said. "Why tell me at all?" Nathan glanced at Evelyn before answering, something warm passing silently between them. "Because I spent a long time being the kind of man who thought protecting what he had mattered more than doing right by other people," Nathan said. "Somebody taught me better than that eventually. I figured it was time to prove I'd actually learned the lesson." Ruth smiled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Well, Mr. Cole, you've certainly proven something today. Whatever this young woman taught you, I hope she knows how well it took root." Evelyn's cheeks warmed, and Nathan simply smiled the quiet, easy smile that had become far more natural to him over these past difficult months than it had ever been before. The ride back to Silver Creek felt different than any journey Nathan had taken in years. Lighter, somehow the weight of old grievances and inherited fears finally genuinely lifting from his shoulders. "You surprised me back there," Evelyn said, as they rode side by side beneath a wide, clear sky. "Most men would have fought that claim just on principle. I spent 8 years thinking principle meant never letting anyone take anything from me," Nathan said. "Turns out principle actually means doing right by people, even when it costs you something. I learned that from watching you fight for the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet." Evelyn reached over and took his hand as they rode, and for a long, peaceful stretch, neither of them said anything more, simply enjoying the rare, uncomplicated comfort of a problem finally, honestly resolved. Word of Nathan's decision to return the disputed land to Ruth Whitfield spread through Silver Creek even faster than the earlier rumors about scandal and fraud had spread, and this time the town's reaction carried nothing but genuine, unreserved admiration. "Never thought I'd see the day," Hiram Coates admitted at the general store, shaking his head with something between amusement and respect as he restocked his shelves. Nathan Cole giving away land instead of fighting to keep every inch of it. Whatever changed that man, I hope it stays changed. "It's not what changed him," Mrs. Abernathy said from behind the counter, glancing meaningfully toward the window where Evelyn could be seen passing by on her way to collect supplies for the ranch. "It's who?" By the time autumn settled fully over Silver Creek, painting the surrounding hills in deep gold and burnished copper, the Cole Ranch had transformed into something Nathan barely recognized from the isolated fortress it had been just months earlier. The dining table that had once held a single lonely plate now regularly seated a dozen people or more ranch hands who'd become something closer to family after everything they'd weathered together. Charlotte, who had decided to stay in Silver Creek rather than return to the wreckage of her old life in Bozeman, slowly building a modest, independent existence, teaching at the local schoolhouse, and occasionally Ruth Whitfield's family, who had become unlikely but genuine friends after the honest resolution of their unexpected land dispute. One crisp October evening, as the ranch hands finished their supper and drifted off toward the bunkhouse, Nathan found himself alone with Evelyn on the porch, watching the sun sink low behind the mountains in brilliant streaks of orange and violet, the same view that had witnessed so much of their story unfolding these past months. "I never got to finish what I started saying," Nathan said quietly, the morning that rider interrupted us. Evelyn turned to look at him, something in his tone immediately catching her full attention. "I remember," she said softly. Nathan reached into his coat pocket, and this time nothing interrupted him. He withdrew a small, simple ring, nothing extravagant, nothing like the expensive rings he'd once offered to women who'd wanted his money far more than they'd ever wanted him. "This isn't like the others," Nathan said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability written plainly across his face. "I'm not offering this because I need someone to fill an empty house, or because this town expects me to finally succeed at something I've failed at 7 times before. I'm offering this because you walked into my life with nothing but an old horse and a request for honest work, and somehow without even trying, you taught me how to actually live again instead of just surviving." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling slightly as Nathan continued. "You never asked me to change," he said. "You never tried to fix me or fight my walls or convince me I was broken and needed saving. You just stayed. Through every threat, every fire, every armed man in the darkness, every old ghost from my past resurfacing to test whether what we'd built together was strong enough to survive it. You stayed, Evelyn, when staying was the hardest, most dangerous choice available to you. I stayed," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion, "because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a place to survive and started being the only place I wanted to call home." "Evelyn Harper," Nathan said, his own voice rough with emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. "Will you marry me? Not because this town needs to see me finally succeed at keeping a wife. Not because circumstances forced either of us into this moment, but because I choose you freely and completely, exactly the way you once told me you needed to be chosen." Evelyn didn't hesitate, didn't need even a single moment to consider her answer. "Yes," she said, tears spilling freely down her cheeks now. "Yes, Nathan, 1,000 times, yes." Nathan slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that weren't entirely steady, and when he finally pulled her close, kissing her beneath the brilliant fading Montana sky, something settled completely into place between them. 8 years of loneliness and months of danger, finally giving way to something neither of them had quite dared to hope they'd ever find again. They married 3 weeks later in a small, simple ceremony held right there on the ranch, beneath the wide autumn sky, surrounded not by wealth or status, but by the people who had actually earned their place in Nathan and Evelyn's story. Silas and the ranch hands who'd stood beside Nathan through every threat and confrontation, Charlotte, who wept openly through the entire ceremony. Finally at peace with her own past, even as she witnessed Nathan finding happiness beyond it, Sheriff Dawson and Walter Griggs, who had fought alongside them through every legal battle, and Ruth Whitfield's family proof that honesty and integrity could build bridges even out of unexpected conflict. "Never thought I'd see this day," Silas said, raising a glass during the modest celebration that followed the ceremony. His weathered face creased with genuine emotion. 10 years I've worked this ranch, watched the boss turn away every woman who ever walked through that gate. Then Miss Evelyn showed up with nothing but an old horse and more grit than any of us realized at first, and I just knew she was different from the start. To Nathan and Evelyn," Charlotte added, raising her own glass, her voice steady, despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "May you both have everything I once threw away without understanding its true worth." Nathan pulled Evelyn close as the small gathering cheered, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, He felt something he genuinely believed himself incapable of feeling ever again. He felt completely, unguardedly happy. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in deep, quiet snow, and where once Nathan had dreaded the long, isolated months of winter confinement alone in his enormous house with nothing but silence for company, this year felt entirely different. The house was full now, full of warmth, full of laughter, full of the easy, comfortable partnership Nathan had once believed existed only in stories other people told, never in reality, never for a man like him. One quiet evening in late December, as snow fell steadily outside the windows, and a fire crackled warm in the hearth, Evelyn found Nathan standing in his office, staring at the old bundle of letters he'd once kept hidden in his desk drawer. The letters that had first led her to understand the depth of the wound he'd carried for 8 long years. "What are you thinking?" Evelyn asked softly, moving to stand beside him. Nathan looked down at the letters for a long moment before answering. "I used to keep these because I thought they proved something," he said slowly. "Proof that I'd loved once completely, and that it hadn't been enough to keep someone from leaving. I think I kept them as a kind of punishment, honestly. A reminder never to let myself be that vulnerable again." "And now?" Evelyn asked. Nathan gathered the letters carefully, walked to the fireplace, and without hesitation, without any trace of his old guarded reluctance, fed them one by one into the flames. Watching 8 years of carefully preserved pain finally curl and blacken and disappear entirely into ash. "Now I don't need them anymore," Nathan said quietly, watching the fire consume the last remnants of a chapter he'd finally completely closed. "I don't need proof that I loved once and lost. I have proof every single day that I love now, and that this time it's enough. More than enough." Evelyn wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her head against his back, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to quiet embers. Watching the last physical remnant of Nathan's old wound disappear entirely into warmth and light. Spring returned to Montana territory the way it always did, slow and unhurried. At first, then suddenly brilliantly complete the hills around Silver Creek, erupting into vivid green wildflowers, scattering color across pastures that had spent months buried beneath heavy snow. Nathan and Evelyn stood together near the creek that ran along the edge of what had once been the disputed Whitfield boundary, watching cattle graze peacefully across land that finally completely belonged exactly where it should. No lies, no fraud, no forgotten mistakes left buried and festering beneath the surface. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have gone?" Evelyn asked, watching the gentle current of the creek catch the afternoon sunlight. If Ashford's scheme had actually succeeded, if Charlotte had never come forward, if Wendell's desperation that night had ended differently. "Sometimes," Nathan admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it too long. We survived it, Evelyn, all of it. The fraud, the fire, the threats every dangerous night this past year threw at us. We're still standing here together, and that matters more than any of the ways it could have gone wrong instead." Evelyn smiled, leaning into him as his arm wrapped naturally around her shoulders. "Do you ever wonder why I stayed?" Nathan asked, suddenly echoing almost exactly the question he'd once asked her beneath a different sunset months earlier, before either of them had fully understood what they were building together. Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything important in her life. "I know why," she said softly. "Because everyone else who ever came to this ranch saw a difficult man, a cold man, a man not worth the trouble of understanding. I saw a wounded one. And wounded things, Nathan, they don't need someone to fix them. They just need someone patient enough to stay long enough to watch them heal on their own." Nathan turned to face her fully. Something profound and settled moving through his chest, the last remaining traces of 8 years of carefully built walls, finally completely dissolved into something far stronger than isolation had ever managed to be. "You didn't just heal me," he said quietly. "You taught me that healing was even possible in the first place. I'd stopped believing that a long time before you ever arrived at my gate." "We healed each other," Evelyn corrected gently. "I arrived here believing I had nothing left to offer anyone, that grief had taken everything worth giving. You taught me that surviving loss doesn't mean you're finished living afterward. It just means you're ready to build something new with someone patient enough to build it alongside you." Nathan pulled her close, kissing her softly beneath the wide, endless Montana sky. And for a long, peaceful moment, neither of them said anything else at all, content simply to stand together on land that had once nearly torn them apart, now standing as quiet, unshakable proof of exactly how much they'd built together instead. That evening, as they walked back toward the ranch house together, hand in hand, the sound of laughter and easy conversation already drifting out from the kitchen where Charlotte was teaching some of the younger ranch hands how to properly bake bread. Something Silas had been complaining about for months. Nathan paused at the gate, looking back one final time at the wide golden pasture stretching out behind them. 7 brides failed, he said quietly, almost to himself. 7 women walked through that gate believing they could change me, and every single one of them left disappointed because they were trying to fix something that didn't actually need fixing. They just needed to see it clearly. "And the 8th?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew exactly what he'd say. "The 8th woman," Nathan said, turning to look at her with the same steady, unguarded warmth that had become as natural to him now as breathing. "Never tried to change me at all. She simply saw me completely scars and silence and every wall I'd ever built, and she chose to stay anyway." Evelyn reached up and touched his face gently, her own eyes bright with the particular kind of joy that only comes after surviving something difficult enough to make happiness feel earned rather than accidental. "Because real love was never about finding someone perfect, Nathan," she said softly. "It was about finding someone who sees your scars clearly and chooses to stay regardless. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing 2 people can ever choose to build together." Nathan drew her into his arms one final time as the sun sank fully behind the mountains, painting the wide Montana sky in brilliant, unbroken gold. And somewhere behind them, the ranch house glowed warm with lamplight and laughter, no longer a fortress built to keep the world out, but finally, completely a home built to welcome everyone brave enough to stay. The cowboy who had lost every bride before her had finally found the one woman who never tried to own his heart, only asked for the chance to help him open it again. And in that quiet, golden Montana evening, surrounded by everything they had fought so hard to protect, and everyone who had stood beside them, through every danger along the way, Nathan Cole finally understood completely, and without a single remaining doubt, that the coldest hearts were never truly empty. They were simply waiting patiently, faithfully for someone strong enough to stay long enough to find the warmth that had been hidden there all along.